You can? If you hear it in the middle of the night, I can't help it. It's a nightmare thing that often people have, my voice in their ear. Good morning. We'd like to call the meeting of the BSCC to order and welcome all of you here. We're going to begin on a congratulatory note. Mr. Steinhardt has been reappointed, and we are delighted to have you on board. Oh, you'd like to speak, I see.
No, thank you.
Well, you appear to be speaking, so I'm confused.
It's sort of in the nature of be careful what you wish for. So.
Okay.
It's kind of what we thought too.
And we're super excited. The board's in rare form today. I think that was a acceptance on behalf of Mr. Steinhardt.
I accept.
Good to have you. Good to have you. Apparently, he's been reappointed because he has no necktie on today. He's feeling, solid, solid. I'd ask Maria to take the roll call, please. Present.
Mr. Kernan.
Here.
Mr. Powers.
Here.
Mr. Grouden.
Here.
Mr. Dean.
Here.
Ms. Perez. Ms. Brown. Mr. Urtola. Judge Garrett. Mr. Bejarano.
Here.
Mr. Budnick.
Here.
Mr. Steinhardt. Ms. Tornor. We have a quorum.
Thank you very much. And I will note that those two absences were expected and excused. And move on to introduce our well-known in-house counsel, Aaron McGuire, who is present today. And now I will start with bragging notes. As you can see, we have moved in to the millennium with new television monitors and a sound system. And I would like to thank John Painting and Sean Moore. Is John in the room? John's upstairs. John, if you can hear me now, thank you. And for all of your hard work on this effort. There is a bit of a funny story about this. I've been in town this week, and Katie is always very gracious in giving deference to me to let me believe that I'm in charge. And with that said, all week she's been saying, these new mics are sensitive, Linda. They pick up everything, Linda. And so I now will take all of the gracious hints that I have gotten from Katie this week and extend them to all members of the board. This is a very sensitive microphone system. When your green light is on, you are going to be heard all over the room. There are repeaters and they are very efficient. When your green light is off, they are so sensitive that your neighbors might help you be heard across the room. So I tell you that because I don't want you to be offended or embarrassed, and I don't want you to offend me and embarrass me if I hear something said about me in the back of the room. So we're now going to go. Katie, did you want to say anything more about the sound system or do?
Was that a request for a demo?
Yeah. Oh, what?
I did want to. Great turnout today, a full house. So we have for a long time been talking about improving the visibility of the PowerPoint presentations or whatever the board may wish to put up on the board so that the audience can see the information. And then as you can see, perhaps depending on where you're sitting, there are 3 monitors mounted here inside of the board area. So we're very excited about that. And I just wanted to step you through a couple of things. We have an improved microphone system. We've already gone over that the mics are sensitive, and be aware. The sound quality has been enhanced. I know we're not necessarily right into the microphone. You see it gets louder when you do that. And we're wired through throughout the room in the ceiling. So just a little test for the people in the back of the room. Is it sounding all right? Fantastic. We have these nice big screens. This is the first time we've done the demo with a crowd in the room. So I think it works pretty well. And for example, you might remember this attachment when you were reviewing grant awards. It'll be much more visible across the room. These are from prior board materials. And then, as Linda mentioned, we wanted to give congratulations to David Steinhardt. Woo! So that's our new equipment.
Let's leave that up for a while. It's so joyous.
It's the fun things. I'll be glad to. I'll send you the PowerPoint slides. So for the ED report, I do want to be brief. We have a lot on the agenda today, so I will just provide a couple of information items, and then Mr. Steinhardt will provide some information updates, as we like to do periodically, about the work of our two board-connected juvenile justice committees. So David will be coming up on the agenda in just a few minutes, but very briefly, budget-related updates. In Governor Brown's last budget, the 18-19 budget proposal, there was not very much different or new for the BSCC. So I would just highlight a couple of things. As the governor did last year, there was not funding in his January budget proposal for what's now called the CalVIP program. Over the last many years, there has been $9.215 million allocated for gang-related and now violence-related intervention program grants. We'll talk a little bit about the work of the ESC on the current year funding in a moment, but there is no CalVIP funding proposed in the January budget. In prior years, that has come through as a legislative addition, so I suppose that could happen again, but we just don't know yet. The other concerning news, although we are managing it well this year, is that because the STC program funding that counties rely on is funded through the state penalty fund, and that has been a very precipitously declining revenue source. The governor's budget manages those ongoing reductions by reducing the proposed amount in the budget year by $1.3 million. So obviously we'll be working closely with locals to manage that reduction. We will be beginning the budget subcommittee hearings. There is a date already set for the Assembly Budget Subcommittee, and they've asked the BSCC to provide an overview of Prop 47. So we'll provide at the next board meeting the same information that we give to them, which would be just an overview of the grant process and what's out in the field now, and then what's anticipated for the next round. Just a couple of other updates related to ongoing projects. As I mentioned, the CalVIP RFP is in process. Chief Brown chairs that executive steering committee. Thank you so much. And the committee met yesterday here for their Raider training. As you know, as you may recall, the eligibility requirements changed in CalVIP this year so that community-based organizations could apply directly. And we all anticipated a significant increase in the number of proposals. We wound up receiving 121 proposals total, which is very, very significant and a reflection of the needs across the state. So that is, the entire pot is $9.215 million. The Budget Act consistently sets aside $1 million for direct allocation to the city of Los Angeles, but the 8.215 is competitively awarded. And the requests that came in total right around $54 million total for an $8.2 million grant, which is, it's going to be a difficult job, I think, for the committee to, they'll just be required to select the very best among those proposals. 91 came from community-based organizations and 30 proposals came from cities. Chief Brown, anything to add about that work?
I just want to thank the staff. 121 proposals was a heavy lift, and Colleen's done a great job. And also the research staff, get this right. Casey. I always want to call her Kaylee. I don't know why, but Casey and Ashley just really did a good job on figuring out, how to statistically and in a valid method rank those. And I'm very appreciative for that. So thank you.
Agree with that, Chief Brown. We are going to be able to assign those proposals out for rating to panels, and we have all the provisions in place to ensure that the process for rating is valid, and really appreciate the work of our research team on that. The recommendations for funding will come back to the board in April. Let's see, there was a January 2018 response from the federal government, the Office of the Chief Fiscal Advisor, to let us know that we've adequately addressed their recommendations, which were technical and clarifying on some of our federal grants. We also had the State Controller's Office complete a Prop 47 audit during the week of January 8th of 2018, and we expect their preliminary report in March of 2018. we are getting ready to release in March of this year the first consolidated JJCPA and YOBG annual legislative report. And that concludes my update. I'm happy to take any questions if you have them. Oh, also there is a legislative report in your binder that summarizes the bills of interest that have been introduced this year to date and any that may be continuing from last year. The bill introduction deadline has not yet hit. That's February 16th. So we'll keep updating you as bills of interest come about. Madam Chair?
And I would simply add a couple of updates, although this has been a long recess through the Christmas holidays. I have had an opportunity and the pleasure of visiting a couple of locations throughout the state, and I'd like to report back on those. One was a visit to San Luis Obispo County, where the probation chief there is running a new program where he is housing young placement juveniles who are prone to running, and he has softened the unit. He has expanded the services to that population, and myself, Diane Cummings, and actually Sheriff Dean went to look at that program. It was really uplifting to see him move towards a program of this kind, because from my experience as a chief in Fresno County, those placement individuals that run a lot often are the ones that accelerate bad behaviors and end up in a great deal of trouble simply because they're a runner. And so I was really happy to see that. He did some very creative funding, I don't want to say manipulation, but some funding efforts to partner with people in San Luis County. I was super happy to see that. While we were there, we had an opportunity to visit the jail with Sheriff Parkinson, and that was also something pleasant to see. It's for women detainees. It is full of natural light. It has room for programming, and it is absolutely, I think, what was in the governor's mind's eye as he began to roll out funding for program facilities. It was very, very positive in nature. And actually, Sheriff Parkinson admitted that he had been given a fair amount of pressure to move it to a male facility, and he felt strongly that the women had been in dire surroundings for a very long time, and so he continued on this trek and moved forward with it. I also, this week, was in Tuolumne County for a groundbreaking of their new facility, which is, for this board's information, the partnership of AB 900 and 1022 funding for one facility built under the same roof. And when I heard the sheriff speaking, it was really, yet again, a pleasant reminder of the shift that we've had as this administration came in to power in California. Talked a great deal about programming and reduction of recidivism and the positive environment in that facility. And finally, next week I go to I think it's a 1022 facility in Stanislaus County, where they, one was a groundbreaking, so we just turned dirt. Next week, we're actually going to open the doors to a program facility. So we've all been here for a fair amount of time, and so it's great to see some of these programs come to fruition. Anything else from the board on sort of updates you want to share? Anything? Nothing? Okay. Moving now, Katie, to legislative report. Oh, you did? I'm sorry, I apologize. So,
Materials in your binder and more to come.
okay. And the legal update from council.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. Just to start my legal update, I wanted to flag for you that we have 2 RFPs on the agenda today. So that to the extent our members might be interested in applying for that money, we would ask you to recuse. I've already spoken with Sheriff Dean, and he'll be stepping out of the room for the RSAT discussion. The other proposal is the Proud Parenting Grant, and probation departments are eligible, as well as CBOs are eligible for that particular funding. Chief Ortola chaired that committee, so he's not eligible to apply, but Chief Brown, you may want to take a quick look at that grant and see if you might be interested, at which point we'd ask you to step out of the room as well. I also wanted to give a brief legal update. We do have a closed session on the agenda, but I don't think that will be necessary for us to go into today. In terms of updates regarding the burn jag litigation, I think the status of the burn jag litigation is pretty well public. There's been several news articles about it, so I thought I'd go ahead and just give that briefing to you in open session today. We don't really have any strategies to discuss at this point. What has happened recently is there was oral argument that was held in the Seventh Circuit. The Seventh Circuit is the appellate court that is over the Chicago litigation. The Chicago litigation is sort of the lead on the burn jag litigation, in which case there's a nationwide injunction right now with respect to the notice and access conditions that the federal government decided to put into this fiscal year's burn jag application. That oral argument happened. It appears that the appellate court would be siding with Chicago, but that opinion has not come out yet. And we'll have to wait potentially several months to figure out exactly what the status of that is. You may also recall, of course, that the California Attorney General has sued the federal government as well. There was an oral argument that was held in December in the U.S. District Court in the Northern District in San Francisco. In that case is being heard by Judge Orrick. Judge Orrick didn't seem to be in much of a rush to decide that case, as he was looking at the Seventh Circuit litigation. So that case seems to be trailing as well. Also, in the meantime, on January 24th, we received a letter from the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Justice Programs, requesting additional documentation regarding our compliance with 8 U.S.C. 1373. The request seeks all documents reflecting any orders, directives, instructions, or guidance to your law enforcement employees on how they interact and communicate with the Federal Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, and/or Immigration and Customs Enforcement. We're looking at that letter on how to respond right now. As it turns out, the Board of State and Community Corrections does not have any law enforcement employees, and that may be our response back to the federal government. But we're having some additional discussions as to whether or not other state law enforcement agencies should respond to that request as well. So with that, if there are any questions, Madam Chair, that's my legal update.
Any questions?
A brief question. So the funds that the federal authorities were targeting were burn jag. Are there others? I've been reading conflicting accounts about the funds that have been pegged for possible withdrawal based on our sanctuary policies.
So yeah, and that's been a little bit confusing as well. So initially there was the executive order by the president that indicated a desire to withhold federal funding in general for non-cooperation with ICE. The city of, or the county of Santa Clara and the city and county of San Francisco sued on that particular executive order. And there was an injunction that was imposed by Judge Orrick to say that that funding, that other federal funding could not be in jeopardy. And because of the spending clause of the U.S. Constitution, the only funding that might be in play would be federal law enforcement related grants. That's the burn jag funding, which is both a state program and local program. Local agencies can apply directly for that, as well as the COPS federal grant program. The other grant programs, even though there might be some law enforcement component, for example, the RSAT program, they have not attached those same immigration cooperation conditions to the RSAT program. And we have not seen those other conditions attached to the Title II juvenile funding as well. So it is, the litigation is now very narrowly focused on just the burn jag funding and the COPS funding.
All right, we're going to now move to the consent items. Before I do that, I'd like to remind anyone in the audience that wishes to make comments on particular agenda items to ensure that they have filled out a card. Make sure on that card you note what agenda item you would like to address. And you can hand those cards to, there she is, Tracy, or Maria. If Tracy's totally busy, you may hand it to Maria also. So moving to the consent
So,
item.
Madam Chair, I think we have the juvenile justice reports, number.
Oh, I apologize.
How could you forget?
Brand new, and I went right past you. That really, it wasn't,
I know.
intentional.
I know.
But thank you for helping the chair out.
So it is my task to give a brief update on the work of the two juvenile committees. We do have two juvenile justice committees, the Juvenile Justice Standing Committee and the State Advisory Group on JJ and DP. The two committees have different focuses in their origins. The State Advisory Group, appointed completely by the governor, has a primary task of developing the state plan submitted to the federal government for juvenile justice funds. The JJSC is chosen by this three-branch body, BSCC, and is focused mainly on state-based mandates and the mission and mandates of BSCC. So while there are key differences, there is a lot of overlap between what the two committees do. And so that has called for a high degree of coordination, and we've really been working closely together with the two committees and with the staff to make that coordination happen. So recently, this second half of the year, we provided for cross membership between the two committees so that I sit on the federal committee, the SAC-JJDP, and Rachel Rios, the relatively new chair of that group, sits ex officio on our committee. We're also going to have our first combined meeting in March because both committees are developing a long-term juvenile justice plan. So just to note that that coordination effort is underway. In terms of the specific work we've been doing, the Juvenile Justice Standing Committee has produced the AB 1998 Race and Ethnicity Report that's coming up as a consent item. The two committees have met together to make recommendations on the juvenile facility standards that are also coming to the board for approval today. The Juvenile Justice Standing Committee has been working to plan an update of BSCC's Juvenile Detention Profile Survey, and we've done a very extensive review of legislation and juvenile justice trends and continue to work on our plans for the future. The State Advisory Committee has been hard at work approving the now due federal state plan for 2018 to 2020 for Title II federal funds. And that work is supposed to be completed and come to this board for approval at the next meeting. And then the State Advisory Group has also approved the AB 1998 report and considered the recommendations for upgrades of the Juvenile Detention Profile Survey. And the State Advisory Group has a lot of new members, a lot of youth members, recently expanded by the governor, and has done a terrific job of holding community forums to take input from youth and members of the public on where juvenile justice should go in California and what the BSCC role is. So that's a brief update. I just wanted to conclude with a kind of an overview to advise the board on where juvenile justice policy is headed, because the juvenile justice system in California is in a transforming mode. It's undergoing change at the highest policy levels. The old traditional age baseline between the juvenile and the adult systems, over and under 18, is beginning to evaporate, and we're seeing a shift of older youth into juvenile programs and facilities without regard to that traditional line, 18 and 21s, for example, so that they gain the programming and protections of the juvenile system. And this reflects a national trend that's really quite solid and expanding and grounded in rulings by the United States Supreme Court that are founded on, and you've heard it before, brain science and adolescent development. And those rulings are compelling states to reconfigure the penalties and the rights and the levels of care that have to be provided, not just to juveniles who are under the old ages of majority, but to a wider population that includes youth at older ages. And in California, we see this coming to pass in lots of different ways. We see new pilot programs to house young adults in state and local juvenile facilities, even in the governor's latest budget proposal. And we see changes in adult sentencing law that entitle juveniles who have long or life sentences in the adult system to be considered earlier for release on parole. And of course, we had Prop 57, the governor's 2016 ballot initiative, ending prosecutorial direct file on juveniles. So these are changes, they're profound changes, and there are more to come, and they affect BSCC in multiple ways, from our facility standards to our grant awards. Both juvenile committees are hyper aware of this transforming trend, and all of the work that they do is in the context of helping California adjust as that trend moves forward. So I just wanted to give that as a kind of an overview context for what the committees are doing.
Thank you, Mr. Stein. I apologize for overlooking you. Any comments or questions for David after his report? Okay, seeing none, any public comments or questions, Mr. Steinhardt? Okay. We're now going to move to the consent calendar. That's item A to C, asking if anybody would like to pull those items. Any questions or comments on those items by the board? Hearing none, I would ask for a motion and second to move those forward. All in favor, say aye. Opposed? Abstained? Motion carries. Thank you. Now we're going to our discussion items, and we'll begin with item D, the RSAT program, and I would invite Colleen forward.
And again, before we begin that item, Madam Chair, I'd ask Sheriff Dean if he would recuse himself at this point. Sheriff Dean might have a remote interest under Government Code Section 1091, and we would note that for the record before we begin the discussion.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Madam Chair and board members. I'm Colleen Stoner, and I'm presenting Agenda Item D. This agenda item requests approval for the release of the requests for proposals for the Residential Substance Abuse Treatment Program, which we'll refer to as RSAT going forward. As you're aware, the Board of State and Community Corrections is the designated state administrative agency for the RSAT program, and it's federally funded through the Bureau of Justice Assistance. The RSAT program was designed to provide funding to break the cycle of drugs and violence by reducing the demand for the use of illegal drugs. RSAT enhances the capability of states and units of local government and tribal government to provide in-custody substance use disorder treatment for inmates and prepare the inmates for their integration into the community through a reentry process that delivers community-based treatment and other broad-based aftercare services. Successful applicants for this funding will be funded for a 3-year cycle. A total of $942,139 is available in federal funding for the first year, which will begin on July 1st, 2018, and a non-competitive request for application for continuance funding will be issued for the second and third years. A 25% local match for the funds is required. You may remember that at the September 14th, 2017 meeting, the board approved the use of the funding for this grant and authorized an executive steering committee to be established to oversee the development of the proposal process. The board appointed Sheriff Dean Groudon as the chair and authorized him to work with staff to name the members of the ESC, which you can find on attachment D2. And thank you very much, Sheriff Groudon, for all your work. It's such a pleasure to work with you. I always enjoy it. The Executive Steering Committee convened on December 6th to develop the proposed program design, application requirements, and the technical components and rating criteria and so forth. The key elements as determined by the committee is that each applicant will be allowed to request up to a maximum of $314,046. And only one local detention facility per county is allowed to apply. Applicants must be able to provide in-custody, jail-based substance use disorder treatment programs that includes aftercare. The in-custody component for participants must be a minimum of at least 3 months and no more than 12. And to the extent possible, separate the treatment population from the general correctional population. The programs are to deliver evidence-based services that focus on cognitive, behavioral, social, vocational, and other skills to solve substance use disorder and related problems. And they are to be prepared to provide successful community reintegration that will involve post-release referrals to appropriate community-based aftercare services, including the use of medication-assisted treatment. The support and encouragement for medication-assisted treatment is an indication of the increasing focus on the opioid crisis at the federal level. And this is the first year that the federal folks have really strongly encouraged us to include that in our design. The program must require urinalysis, and up to 1 year of aftercare services are to be provided upon release. If the board approves, the RFP will be released to the field tomorrow on February 9th, and proposals will be due back to the board by April 6th. At this time, staff recommends that the board approve and release the RSAT grant request for proposals as recommended by the Executive Steering Committee. That concludes my report. Are there any questions?
Any comments, questions from the board? You may make it whenever you like. Now looking for public comments on this matter. Seeing none, I would then look for, you want to make yours after the motion and the vote, correct? I'd look for a motion to adopt the recommendation.
I'll move to approve. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstained? We should note that Sheriff Dean is out of the room. I think that constitutes an abstention. And then I'd welcome your comments.
Thank
Sheriff.
you, Madam Chair. And I'd like to thank Colleen Stoner for her hard work on this project, as well as the researcher Tony Jackson and the members of the ESC. Obviously, we still have a lot of work ahead, but it's a great group of people, very knowledgeable in the area. And, you know, this grant, it's a small amount of money, but it's worth the effort we put into it because it's such a good cause. You know, there have been significant improvements in the way substance use disorders are treated, particularly in custody and in reentry. And I like participating on this ESC because I hope that down the road, there will be additional funding opportunities for similar projects. So, but once again, wanted to thank Colleen for her hard work on this project.
Thanks to everyone for their hard work, and you, Sheriff, for continuing that long drive here to work on these ESCs. But we're not letting you out yet. Lots more work to do on this one. And I'd now move to item E, Proud Parenting Grant Program, request for proposals, requesting approval, and I see Helene coming forward. Doesn't anybody have a PowerPoint here? Because it's really, it's just so darn sad about this. You don't
I
think we
tried
could
to say show tunes and we could
show
put the
tunes?
lyrics
Yeah,
up, but
really.
you know.
And I did want to check before the discussion began whether or not Chief Brown is going to remain in the room. I did get the high sign from Board Member Scott Butnick, however, so let it be known for the record. Mr. Butnick might have a remote interest under Government Code Section 1091, and he has stepped out of the room as well.
Good morning, all. My name is Helene Zentner, and I'm a field representative with the Corrections Planning and Grants Program in that division. This agenda item requests that the board approve the request for proposals, or RFP, as recommended by the Proud Parenting Grant Program Executive Steering Committee, and to authorize the release of the RFP to the field. As you may remember, at the September 2017 meeting, the request was made of this body to authorize the Executive Steering Committee, or the ESC, and their process for the Proud Parenting Grant Program funded by the state's general fund. This action and corresponding timeline were approved, as well as appointing board member and Chief Probation Officer Michael Ortola from Nevada County as chair, and allowing staff to work with the chief to appoint subject matter experts to serve on this ESC. The composition of the ESC has been provided to you as attachment E2 of this item, and I'd like to take this opportunity to publicly and personally thank Chief Ortola and all the ESC members who provided their time and expertise to this process. On November 1st of 2017, the ESC came together with the goal of developing the Proud Parenting Grant Program RFP to establish the rating criteria and the evaluation components. Attachment E1 is the culmination of all their hard work. A few of the elements of this RFP are, this is a 3-year grant period beginning July 1, 2018. The funding for this grant is subject to the monies appropriated in the 2018-2019 State Budget Act. Historically has been $835,000 annually, and the next 2 subsequent budget acts for years 2 and 3 funding. Eligible applicants for grant award are county probation departments, county offices of education, and nonprofit community-based organizations. And I'd like to briefly point out that this is a more expansive eligibility list from prior RFP Proud Parenting grants. The ESC felt that expanding this eligibility would broaden the service elements to provide the services to these youth and would provide a more concerted effort in partnering and collaborating with the other agencies in the county. A maximum of $104,375 may be requested by eligible applicants for a single year of funding, culminating in a 3-year grant cycle maximum amount of $313,125 per awardee. There is a minimum 10% in-kind match requirement for all grant funds requested. And these funds specifically target youth who are under the age of 25, who are either currently a parent or expecting, and who have previously been involved in the criminal or juvenile justice systems and or have been considered crossover youth with the child welfare system. Given this, it is staff's recommendation to approve and authorize the release of the Proud Parenting Grant Program RFP as recommended by the ESC. I thank you, and is there any questions?
Any questions from the board? Thank you, Helene, for all your work on this. And Chief Bertola, anything?
No questions, just a comment. Want to thank Helene and her staff for all the hard work. Even though it was a small ESC group, I think it was a very, very diverse group and very open to new ideas. And so I really enjoyed it. And I look forward to reading the proposals as we go forward.
Any public comment on this item? Seeing none, I'd look to the board for a motion.
So moved.
All members who agree? Opposed? Abstained? Let the record reflect that Board Member Butnick is out of the room. Motion carries. All right, moving along here. Item F. And I'm going to make a few introductory comments before Allison begins. We know about the great interest on this item and that there are many people here today willing and able to participate in the process. So I want to outline a little bit about how we plan to proceed. The board action has a part 1 and part 2. Part 1 recommends approval for the revision that the ESC has reached full agreement on in November. And we'll take that item first. And when we do that, Allison will give her presentation to the board. We'll then take public comment on item 1. And I'd ask you now, Tracy, on item 1, how many public comment cards do you have for that item?
We have 10.
So we would ask for 2 minutes each in that comment arena, and then we would come back to the board and look for a motion.
Let me rephrase, because I put them all in one stack, and we have some on staffing ratios and some on the other regular
We're looking
division.
for item 1, which is everything but staffing ratios.
All right.
Looking for a recalculation here.
What is that? Is that yours? All right. I'm not sure that.
We'll give everybody a few minutes to make sure those are accurate.
Yeah, I think people have to, they didn't necessarily always identify on their cards.
Okay. We'll take a loosely affiliated break with clarification. I didn't say a big break. Just, something that looks like a break that's not really a break. Well, yeah, it's closely aligned with a break, but not a break. But it appears to be a break right now. Yeah, pseudo break, fake break,
One, is that staffing?
not to be confused with anything else fake.
What is one? One? Proposed revisions.
Yes, yes. I don't want to reflect on any of these people coming forward as not following the instructions, but it's good to see you all coming up. Anybody?
That's staffing ratios.
Yeah.
Impossible.
I'm not touching that. You feel free, yeah. What?
Sue Burrell, are you staffing ratios?
Sue Burrell followed the rules, let the record reflect.
Okay. All right. This is fun. They're over there. I got you. Okay, yours is general. Okay. General and staffing. All right. A little bit of everything on these cards. This is going to be fun. All right.
Okay, moving back. So we're going to contain those remarks to 2 minutes. And if there are questions raised during that period of time, what we hope to do is not address them as they are requested or asked. We want to then, if need be, address them at the end of the public comments section on item 1 and item 2. After the public comment section on part 1, we'll take a vote and move forward, and then we'll move to part 2. And at that time, a similar procedure will take place. I don't know how many cards we have right now, but we will.
About 10 on each.
We'll limit that to 2 minutes also, and then come back to the board for comment and discussion. So any questions about the process itself? Anything from the board on the process itself? Okay, then, okay.
I have a process issue that, but I'm going to bring it up for part 2, if that's okay.
Sure.
Not for part 1, okay.
Okay. So welcome, Allison, and part 1 of Title 15 and 24 regulation revision.
Got it. Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the board. Allison Ganter with the Facility Standards and Operations Division. And as Chair Penner mentioned, I will be discussing the Juvenile Title 15 and Title 24 regulations revisions this morning and asking for your approval of the final proposed revisions and also requesting appropriate action on staffing regulations. Again, we do have 2 separate items for discussion. First, I'll present the proposed revisions for your consideration, public comment and approval, and then we'll introduce the staffing regulations for discussion. And just another opportunity for any questions or comments before we begin. Okay, thank you. So the BSCC began this process back in November 2016 when the board appointed members Michelle Brown and David Steinhardt to co-chairs as the Juvenile Regulation Revisions Executive Steering Committee. And I'd like to thank Ms. Brown and Mr. Steinhardt for their tireless work and dedication to this process. Their intense really has, it has been a really intense process, and their focus has been really steadfast. This is the most comprehensive review of the juvenile regulations since the Board of Corrections, which is our predecessor agency, absorbed responsibility for juvenile detention facilities in the mid-90s. So just to give an idea of the magnitude of the work that was done in this process. And in order to create a balanced and well-informed executive steering committee, the BSCC solicited membership from a wide range of individuals and selected members for the executive steering committee that had diverse experience, geographic representation, and also subject matter expertise. While we were getting prepared to have the executive steering committee meet, BSCC staff began soliciting public comment. When the ESC first met in March of 2017, they were presented with more than 300 pages of public comment, including input from youth in juvenile detention facilities. The ESC was also presented with joint recommendations from the BSCC, the two BSCC juvenile justice committees. ESC spent 2 days reviewing regulations for revision and absorbing public comment, both written and in person, as many members of the community attended and to provide their feedback. The ESC then developed general recommendations for revisions and directed staff to convene 8 subject matter work groups to address each section of the regulations. And those work groups were administration, classification, segregation and discipline, programs, education, medical and mental health, environmental health, nutrition health, and physical plans. Before those work groups met, the BSCC again solicited interest in work group membership and comment. Work groups were convened in June and July of 2017. These groups considered public comments, the ESC recommendations, and relied on their own experiences and subject matter expertise to develop proposed revisions for the Executive Steering Committee to consider in September of 2017. ESC met in September and again in November of 2017 to finalize these proposed revisions. And at those meetings, the ESC reached consensus on all revisions with the exception of staffing ratios, and we will take that up as the second part of this item. You have before you in attachment F1 those proposed revisions. Any regulation where there was revision changes are highlighted, strike out, underline. Some of the notable Some notable recommendations are the inclusion of trauma-related care from the addition of definitions to requirements for trauma-informed care in many aspects of services to youth and facility operations, adding assessments for risk of sexual abuse at intake, strengthening requirements for use of force, including training and reporting requirements, and ensuring that chemical agents are only used after attempts at de-escalation have failed, ensuring transition and aftercare plans for medication management and connection to community programs and support upon release, aligning standards for room confinement to recent statutory changes, and also ensuring that youth may have their own underwear throughout their stay in a facility. Overall, these revisions reflect the many positive trends that we see in juvenile justice reform. As juvenile detention facility administrators have embraced change and modeled best practices, services and outcomes for young people continue to improve, and we should be proud of these efforts. Before closing my discussion of this issue, I'd like to again thank Ms. Brown and Mr. Steinhardt and give a shout out to the FSO team that took on this work and did it so well, especially Ginger Wolf, who I call my regulations right hand. There is such a thing. I'm also grateful to the ESC and work group members who for an $11 lunch came and worked hard for many, many days. And I'd also like to recognize and thank everybody who submitted public comment and came to the meetings, especially those that were courageous enough to share their own stories with these groups. Happy to take any questions.
One question that was raised by board members is there a list of ESC members included in this package?
There's not, but we can certainly get one. Wow, okay. Michelle Brown and David Steinhardt. Sorry, I'm gonna have to, yeah. Actually, I'll get it and have it in about 2 minutes.
And while they get the list, would you do a little expansion on how the ESC worked and then the many, many committees that worked with the ESC, just review that as we get that list, how many work groups were?
Sure. So what the Executive Steering Committee does is they are looking at the overall regulations and the subject matter areas. They received a lot of public comment, probably more than you see here. And what the ESC does is make general recommendations for the direction of the actual revisions, and then they direct the 8 subject matter area work groups to dive a little deeper into each regulation. So the ESC doesn't sit around and line by line go through each regulation. That would just take quite some time. So that's why the regulations are broken into those 8 subject matter area work groups. Those work groups do sit and go line by line through each regulation, so using their own lens of experience to discuss with the group and see if changes have been made, or if the ESC for use of force has said, you know, we want to see more training requirements. The work groups will consider those, and then they'll also consider all the public comments that's given. So time and care is spent with each individual regulation and those aspects, their own experiences, the ESC recommendation, any public comment, and then any discussion that comes up during the meetings.
Thank you, Allison.
Sure.
Yes.
So the subject work groups, those were public meetings as well?
They
Yes.
absolutely were, yes. Yes. And we had, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Allison.
Oh, and we had members of the public and additional public comment at those as well.
And I now go to the.
Well,
co-chairs.
I have some comments that I'm going to withhold until we have the public comment on this section. But in answer to Mr. Powers, I made a quick list from recall on who was on the ESC. So by association, we had a youth representative, a very esteemed medical doctor, a behavioral health specialist, and a specialist in trauma-informed care.
Do they have names?
Well, I don't
the
have,
list, yeah.
But
my
yeah,
memory
I have
isn't
the
that
list,
good.
yeah.
We have the list.
Yeah, got the list? Maybe
Yeah.
you can put it up.
Can we put
I
it on
just-
our new system?
Oh, they're gonna put it up on the screen.
Sean's going to put it on the system.
My, sorry about that. I completely blanked out on the members. I knew that, I knew two of them were up here.
Allison, I just want to say, you're just doing this to make the chair feel better about her erroneous behavior often. So I appreciate that. And they're going to put them up. Would you prefer her reading them now?
I'll start, I'll go very slowly.
Okay.
Just so it doesn't ruin the moment. So
Dramatically.
we had three chiefs representing small, medium, large. We had Ted Baran from San Benito County, Marshall Hopper from Placer County, and then Mark Varela from Ventura County. We also had the division director of the Santa Clara County Behavioral Services Department, Dr. Sherry Terraro, and she's the Behavioral Health Services Director. Arash Anosharavani, he is practicing adolescent expert in Alameda County. We had Sue Burrell, who I think is here as well. She's the policy and training director for the Pacific Juvenile Defender Center. We had Rachel Rios. She's the chair of our State Advisory Committee on Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. We also had an expert in trauma-informed care, Dr. Jane Halliday. She's the director of service systems for the National Center for Child Traumatic Stress. We had a youth member, Ashay Jackson. She's a policy advocate for the Anti-Recidivism Coalition. And then we also had an education representative, an attorney named Laura Fair, who's worked in education for youth in detention for many, many years. So it really was a wide range of diverse experience on that executive steering committee.
Thank you, Allison. And let the record reflect that all board members have been handed a hard copy of the membership, and we hope to see it come up. Sean, you know this new system, this is just a test. We left this out intentionally, so you would have to figure out how to get it up there. So,
All planned.
yeah, all a big plan. Okay, turning to the board for any comments. Joe.
I'm also going to reserve some of my comments until after public comment, but I wanted to thank the participants. Allison, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is the first time on juvenile regs that it was open. The work groups were open to the public, right?
That is correct.
And very, very robust conversations, both in the work groups and at the ESC. I want to thank all of the members that were mentioned, but also the public that showed up. We saw many people who spent a lot of their time coming to work group meetings and ESC meetings and were deeply involved in the conversation. So that was greatly appreciated. I feel really good about some of the progress that we've made with this. I think there were a lot of really good changes and really proud of the work that was done. And we will get into the one item that we weren't able to resolve. And like I said, I just want to again remind everybody that these are minimum standards and that any department could choose to go above those in any area. But again, thank you to everybody that participated. Appreciate it.
All right. Any other board members before we begin public comment? Okay, I'd invite Tracy to begin. And remember, apologies, but it is a 2-minute time limit. We have a lofty agenda today,
And I will call people up 3 at a time. You can just line up behind the speaker so we can go through this more quickly, starting with Virginia Corrigan, Rosie McCool, Sue Burrell.
Hello, my name is Virginia Corrigan. I'm a staff attorney with the Youth Law Center. The Youth Law Center is pleased with much of the progress in these proposed regulation revisions, in large part because of the open and participatory process that led to them. And we wanted to extend our thank yous to the Executive Steering Committee and to the BSCC staff who made that process possible. That said, there are areas where California can and should go further to protect our juveniles and ensure that our juvenile facilities are providing a safe, supportive, and rehabilitative environment for our youth. First, on education, the Youth Law Center was honored to have our policy advocate, Lucy Salcido Carter, participate in the education work group. We're heartened to see enhanced protections for school access, transition planning, and higher education. That said, the Youth Law Center hopes to see further progress around higher education and tech access. Some in the room may have attended the Youth Law Center and the College of San Mateo's recent conference on higher education access in juvenile facilities. Youth in our juvenile justice system hunger for the opportunity to participate in higher education, and we should be providing them with that opportunity. YLC hopes to see the seeds that are planted in this current regulation revision cycle blossom, and for all facilities to begin providing this opportunity for their youth. Second, tech access, both for education and communication purposes. California really should be at the vanguard of providing this to our youth in facilities and providing them what they need to become able to participate in the 21st century information economy. Some facilities are already providing this so that we know it can be done safely and effectively. For example, we know that San Diego County is using Skype to allow young people to communicate with their families. The Youth Law Center believes that reasonable access to technology for the purpose of education and communication should be a requirement. Finally, the Youth Law Center continues to believe that chemical agents and chemical sprays should be barred inside juvenile facilities. They're harmful, both physically and psychologically for young people. They're counterproductive to the rehabilitative
I'm going to have to ask you to
mission.
bring it to a close, please.
Will do.
Thanks.
And they're out of step with national best practice on this issue.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, Madam Chair and board members. My name is Rosie McCool with the Chief Probation Officers of California, often referred to as CPOC. CPOC represents the 59 probation chiefs throughout the state of California. Chiefs appreciate that there are many revisions and updates contained within attachment F1 that is before us right now. Chief Probation Officers working on the work groups and the Executive Steering Committee have worked earnestly on these revisions to come to consensus on the regulations that reflect best practice to ensure a safe, secure, and evidence-based model is maintained within our institutions. We are opposed to the banning of OC spray as it is a valuable tool among many in instances where there are only moments to react and mitigate serious injury to youth and/or staff. And as Allison stated, I just wanted to reiterate a point. We also believe that the proposed regulations before you, they reflect best practice. They limit the use of OC spray to only when a youth's life is at imminent risk. It's reflective of best practice, and we agree that the policy also updates and are supportive that the policy updates the documentation that's required. There's additional training that is required specific to this, and so we applaud the work of the ESC and the work group that took this up. We want to also thank all the members of the work groups and the ESC for their work undertaking this very important effort. They are to be commended for their professionalism, commitment to youth, and dedication in undertaking this effort. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Burrell, before you begin, I want to call up Israel Villa, Dominic Nong, Dario Soto, and Brian Goldstein.
I'll make this fast. I'm kind of the ghost of Christmas past because I've been coming here since the antecedent agency, about 3 agencies ago, took over the inspection capacity for the state of California. And I've been in all the working groups every time there have been revisions over the years. And I want to say that this revision cycle was completely different and about 400% better than anything we've experienced in the past. And I think Allison was very modest about her role in this. She did a masterful job of planning this, inviting public input, engaging people from outside BSC. And every part of it was good. The co-chairs were great, David and Chief Brown. The co-chairs of each working group were great, and the people on the working group were prepared and ready to engage. And I just think we did so much good work this time. And I also think that all of us in this room owe a big debt to the California Endowment, who supported training community people and including many people who have been system involved in how to be a part of this process. And we just had such fantastic input. So I am very happy with the process and with the changes we made this time. And I strongly recommend that the board adopt this package.
Thank you.
Good morning, buenos dias. My name is Israel Villa. I'm the Program and Policy Coordinator for MILPA, Motivating Individual Leadership for Public Advancement in Salinas. I was fortunate and very honored to be selected for one of the work groups. I was on the programs work groups, and I must say that it was quite the experience. It's not what I anticipated. I'll be honest with you, have a very, very long abusive relationship with our system. So I don't really see our system or probations and parole officers as friends. I've always viewed them as foes. And this experience was a little bit of a healing. I'm not saying I'm all the way healed. Some of you are nice, some of you are not, right? But it was a healing. It helped me for my own personal healing in my journey. So I'm also very, very enthusiastic, very proud of these revisions. This is the first time we've heard of it. Quite a few of us applied, and I thank those responsible for allowing us to be part of this process. My work group was amazing. There are some cool probation officers out there. As far as any issues, I know one concern that we still have is regarding the pepper spray. I myself have been a victim of pepper spray a lot of times. Most of the time, because I was off the hook, no doubt. I used to fight, I used to act up. I was off the hook. However, there was also a lot of times where it was not called for. You know, just mouthing off, getting attitude, so on and so forth. But the bottom line, I don't believe that it's necessary. There's plenty of other states that are showing us that it's not necessary. They're doing fine without it. I believe with the proper training and with some love, I believe they can handle these kids without the use of pepper spray. And if it is going to be maintained, again, I know that now they have to document the incidents, but I would also ask for oversight, that they're reviewed and really scrutinized, because I know that is a practice that's been widely abused and misused. And again, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Good morning, Dominique Nam from the Children's Defense Fund, California. I have watched and been involved with this over a year-long process. I've been heavily involved, probably more than most, outside of BSCC staff. And as Ms. Ganter, as the co-chairs and others have noted, this process has been notably more inclusive of the public, as represented by the over 300 pages of public comment, as well as balanced in terms of the diversity of stakeholders and subject matter experts involved. And in public meetings prior, there has been much public appreciation and acknowledgement of the true value of including this diversity of stakeholders in this process. And so these are achievements that are worth celebrating, and I do want to take this moment to sincerely thank the ESC co-chairs and the BSCC staff who worked so hard for so many hours to achieve these successes. And so today, I also urge you to view this process not only as a success, but as a learning tool, because as discussed earlier in this meeting, you all are going through your strategic plan process, and a number of staff members are going to be focusing on how to ensure a fair, inclusive, and transparent decision-making process. And so moving forward, based on these title regulations, you now have a number of contact information of people that you can directly reach out to, members of the public, to ask, hey, how did you hear about this survey? Was it from us or was it from someone else? And how can we make it more accessible? You can talk to the over 130 applicants who were youth justice advocates, attorneys, families and friends of incarcerated youth, and individuals with direct experience in the facilities, many of whom were not selected, and ask them, did they feel that the application process was fair and inclusive? And if not, how can we improve it? And then ask the work group members themselves, did they feel like they were placed and put in positions where their expertise was best utilized and capitalized? So this was a great success. I only hope that you look at this and really examine and debrief in a way to see how you can replicate this in other aspects of your operations. I also would just like to support others and ask that you both approve of the many recommendations put forth, but also that you move forward in ending the use of chemical spray. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Dario Soto. I'm with MIPA, Motivating Individual Leadership for Public Advancement. Today, I have a testimony from a 17-year-old EJ who's been impacted by the use of chemical spray. And he says, the first time I was maced while incarcerated was when I was 14 or 15. I was in the middle of a fight and the guard maced me directly in my eyes. As soon as it happened, I fell and hit the floor. I have asthma, and the pepper spray made me feel like I was having an asthma attack. Excuse me, I have allergies. I couldn't breathe. Next, they handcuffed me and put me in my room and left me alone for 10, 15 minutes with the chemicals on my face. I was coughing, had shortness of breath, and couldn't see. I couldn't open my eyes. Once they finally brought me out to go to the shower, one of the guards told me to take a hot shower, which made it sting and burn more. It was a terrible experience. During all the years of incarceration, there are at least 6 other times when others were sprayed, but I was in the room and was also affected. Each time, I instantly had shortness of breath. I believe pepper spray should be banned from the youth facilities. The last time I was in Sacramento County youth lockup, I had an issue with the peer, and 2 staff brought us together and used conflict resolution, and that solved our problem, and we are able to do programs together. Being pepper sprayed has a permanent impact on my vision. Before pepper spray, I didn't have a problem seeing, but after, my vision is not as good, even to this day. Please do more to protect young people and ban the use of pepper spray against incarcerated youth. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Brian Goldstein with the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice. First, I want to thank the co-chairs, the executive steering committee members, the work group members, and the BSCC staff. As was just raised, the Title 1524 Regulations Executive Steering Committee arguably is a model for BSCC to look to, as was the Prop 47 Executive Steering Committee. It shows the real impact of community engagement and involvement. So we want to thank all of those individuals, and we certainly want to thank the 300 plus individuals that submitted public comment, that took surveys, that offered their direct experience within these facilities. It's important for all of us to recognize ultimately what these regulations are about. They're grounded in protecting young people, protecting them from violence, from trauma. And so while we support many of the recommendations to these revisions, we take issue with the continued reliance on chemical spray. The ESC, it should be noted, they had a lot of discussion around this issue. There were serious concerns given the public comment, given the survey responses, and given the fact that California is out of step nationally and with other jurisdictions across the country. Even in California, I toured Santa Cruz's juvenile hall. They don't have chemical spray within their facility. If there's an issue, they call the police and the police will come, but it's not an issue that regularly comes up. While the long-term health impacts of chemical spray remain unknown, the long-term trauma is known. We've just heard it. And while it's a current tool used by probation, solitary confinement, room confinement, that was a tool. State moved beyond it. We can move beyond this. Chemical spray isn't evidence-based. It's not trauma-informed. It's trauma-inducing. And it's time California join other jurisdictions in ending this practice. Thank you.
Thank you. We have exhausted all the speakers card, and I now turn back to the board.
Thank you. Where to begin? I mean, you've heard it. This really was an amazing process that was different from every other juvenile facility standards process that I've been on, and I've been on 3 or 4 over a 20-plus year span. There were really 4 checkpoints in this process. The 2 juvenile committees made recommendations. The working groups, which were also balanced, made recommendations. 3rd level was the ESC, and I'll call the 4th level the massive public comment that we had. And the public comment was amazing, not just because of how much there was, but the quality and the specificity of public comment really helped guide us toward changes we made as we moved along the way. And so it was different in that respect. This really is an amazing set of standards in terms of the reach and expanse. There's some highlights. I think I don't need to go over them. Um, One comment on chemical spray. Um, we went pretty far. This was so deeply debated at every checkpoint that I described. And I think that within the regulatory process, which is what we're talking about here, we got about as far down the pike as it was possible to do. And so when you look at section 1357, it does not look like the old section. And it imposes new standards for when chemical agents can be used, a de-escalation requirement that's in there before it can be used, new documentation requirements that any officer has to think about before using pepper spray, decontamination provisions, training provisions. So did we get a total ban? No. Was there support in the ESC for a total ban? Pretty strong, but probably not a majority. So I think the next step, and I say this to the advocates in the room who would like to see change and see California come into step with a majority of the country on using pepper spray in juvenile facilities, that this is going to now go into the legislative forum. And we have a bill already introduced, AB 2010, a near full ban on pepper spray in juvenile facilities. So the legislature is going to provide the next step and the next forum if we're going to go beyond what's now proposed in the regulations. So that's really all I have to say about that. Again, I just want to thank especially the staff. They were overloaded at all points. This was a massive amount of information. If you can imagine what 300 pages of public comment looks like, it's a lot for the staff and it's a lot for the ESC. So I'm very pleased because this is a much more a set of standards that are much more sensitive to youth crossing all boundaries and in all areas of need, conforms to state law changes, and adopts best practices across multiple disciplines. So I'm supportive and I'm happy to make a motion to adopt, if that would be appropriate at this point, to adopt the Part 1 a cluster of standards revisions.
Hold the motion for
Did
a
I get a
moment.
little-
Looking for any other
Yeah.
comment from the board.
I just very quickly want to also thank Allison and the staff. It was a lot. And, to listen to her speak, you don't realize the amount of hours and work that went into it. And she constantly was very attentive to making sure that we were briefed, that we knew what we had in front of us for each meeting that we had. And more importantly, we knew what we were thinking in terms of what we wanted on paper, and many times gave her very little, and she would then give us the language. And it was very well done. So very appreciative for you and your staff that I know put a lot of work into this. So thank you.
Thank you.
So first, I want to thank the BSCC and in this ESC for creating a process that everyone thought was just really collaborative and fair. Even the ghost of Christmas past, Sue Burrell, the best times 4 in decades. I'd love to get a little more clarification. One of the public speakers from CPOC said that the chemical spray language here reflects best practices. David Steinhardt just said it's out of step with the majority of the country. That seems to go into conflict. So I just would love a little more information. I have some personal issues. I actually just launched an investigation myself of an incident where a PO had a handcuffed kid on the floor, unloaded an entire can of spray, reloaded, unloaded an entire can of spray, face down handcuffed, and then a third can of spray and reloaded. So I think it just opens up a lot of huge issues. I think when you see probation staff that have relationships and can communicate, they can de-escalate virtually anything. I think pepper spray is for staff that don't have those tools or are a little bit, I just find it a little lazy and weak. But I would love to know what the national model is and how these conflicting comments, what the truth is.
I'd like to just add to Mr. Budnick's comments. I'm not even aware of, and I support a study being done and some research and data of why we would want to eliminate OC spray, because I'm not aware of any current research and data out there that supports eliminating OC spray. Although I support the use of OC spray in the appropriate way, I also want to put on the record, just like you were saying, I'd love to see a study done, whether it be with BSCC in collaboration with CPOC, to be able to put together a study so we can actually look at the impacts and not only on youth, but staff also.
I just wanted to get some clarification regarding the motion. Is it possible to have a substitute motion where we pull the particular item out regarding the OC spray? Because I'd hate to see the baby get thrown out with the bathwater, because I'm opposed to the use of OC spray in the facility, especially seeing that there are so many agencies that don't require it, but I'm good with the rest of the issues. And in light of my current employment, I think it is important to have some type of avenue or way to have an outside entity, if you will, look at when the exigency is needed to use it. Because I think she mentioned there has to be the threat of life or safety or security. But as a former police officer, I can write a report to reflect exactly what I needed to say in a time that when I need to do something that I deem appropriate at that time, if that makes sense. So I think it's a lot easier for a person who's using the pepper spray to articulate why they would need it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they breached all avenues to try and de-escalate the situation. So if there were some other entity that could kind of look at those exigencies, like I think it's a good tool to have if it's needed, but it can easily be abused or something. Exactly. That's my point. And you can articulate it as well.
That's certainly not appropriate use of it in any probation or police setting or anything like that. I will tell you, I'm a dinosaur. I started in probation back in the mid-'80s. I worked in those juvenile halls before pepper spray was there, and I saw kids with broken arms, broken shoulders. I saw staff with, broken limbs from dogpiling into large disturbances and things like that. So I saw what pepper spray did when it was introduced into the juvenile facilities, because I was a supervisor at the juvenile hall in San Diego when it got introduced, and we saw significant decreases in injuries to kids and staff. And I certainly understand the impact of being pepper sprayed. It's horrible. It feels bad, but it's over in 20 minutes, half hour, 40 minutes, something like that. The physical part of it is over, but you break an arm, you break a clavicle, you do those kinds of things. That's with you forever. So I certainly wouldn't oppose, and I think looking at those numbers would be a good idea. But I think we're talking about minimum standards here. In those counties that want to remove pepper spray, they're free to do so. In those that utilize it, I think the proper documentation of the use of force should go along, not just with pepper spray, but any use of force. The review of use of force should occur as well. And I think that oversight of that is certainly appropriate. And if it's used inappropriately, absolutely. I think back to Los Angeles County, where I spent some time. Some of our facilities had pepper spray and some didn't. And that was a determination that was made on the setting, based on the setting, open setting versus a locked setting. And so I think those are decisions that are made at the local level and should be allowed to be made at the local level versus mandating or removing what some jurisdiction may see as a valuable tool and others may not. The example of calling the police that was given for Santa Cruz County, frankly, by the time the police get there and get inside the facility, you may have a really bad situation at that point if you're going to wait for the police to come in and handle that. So I don't know that calling the police is the best response to that as well. So I think you allow the individual jurisdiction to determine how they're going to handle that. And that's why we call it minimum standards. Yep.
Chief Bejarano.
Yeah, I was going to add also that even though it's stated several times, it's really significant, the amount of effort that went into the process. When you take a look at the experience, the expertise of the ESC, the working committees, the line-by-line work, the standing committees, a tremendous amount of effort went into the revisions. And I believe also one of the speakers, Mr. Bryan, mentioned the protection of youth, and that's what we're looking at with these revisions. And we know that obviously chemical agent is a big part of the conversation here, but I believe it protects youth when used with the proper oversight and supervision and holding people accountable, and also protecting staff. As mentioned, also these are minimum standards. And I believe also mentioned was the fact that there is some movement as far as possibly through an assembly bill. But again, significant work, and I believe on the use of force, again, there's a re-emphasizing de-escalation as opposed to the use of chemical agents. So again, I think it's significant, and these minimum standards, and I'm willing to support the revisions presented before us, but I'm also, if you want to take out that portion for a separate vote, I'm fine with that also.
So my comment to that is if we pull it out, I would assume then you're probably going backwards to the old way. You're right. So I think this is good progress. I think oversight and documentation is a good thing. I'm fine with the way this is written up. So I'm not so sure we'd want.
If I might comment, from my experience as a probation chief and knowing that all law enforcement in communities has a continuum of force that they are trained to use. And unfortunately, when you hear instances like what Mr. Budnick just described to us, there are none of us at this board that are comfortable with that and understand that use of force is overzealous, unacceptable, and we cannot have that. I think there were instances when I was the chief in Fresno where I was sadly impacted by some of my staff's use of the tools that we had given them. But at the same time, I reckoned with the idea that we reduce the number of injuries to both staff and young people in our facilities because we had these tools available. I would like to suggest that we honor the work of this executive steering committee and do not begin to piece by piece dismantle it. We all know that we want law enforcement, juvenile probation staff to have the tools to work with to keep them safe. If one suggests that you take away OC because it's inappropriately utilized, you could say that about the many tools that we give individuals, and we go all the way up to the use of force, including firearms. And I don't think any of us would support not utilizing that. So I'd ask the board to consider honoring the amount of man hours that went into this recommendation. That is not to say man and woman hours, I apologize. That is not to say that there is not room for further investigation, further study, and to consider this again in other forums. I think we all know that this does not put it to bed, but it creates yet again, as we'd like to repeatedly say today, that minimum standard from which we can move forward.
It'll be quick, I promise, because I don't want to belabor this, but I think the only issue that I'm having with it is not so much having it available when it's necessary, but whatever proponents will be in place to make sure that it's not abused in a sense. Because I think just the reporting standards, to write it in a report to be reviewed by a supervisor, will not necessarily minimize the abuse of it. So I think that if you have situations like in a school where teachers can go and stop a fight without using pepper spray because it's not available to them, then I think that you can also have it the same in a correction facility. So I think it has, like Mr. Budnick said, a lot more to do with the relationship. And if you have a tool that's readily available to you without that need to explain why you used it, then you're going to be a lot more likely to go to it as an issue or a way to stop something. So you can easily write in a report, I tried to de-escalate the situation by telling them to stop fighting 3 times, and then I pepper sprayed them. That might be deemed as appropriate de-escalation, if that makes sense. So I just feel like if there were not taking it away, but still stronger standards in place as to where and when you should be able to use that, then that's appropriate enough with somebody else looking at, was it actually appropriate? So I don't know how that works out in this, and maybe it doesn't work out in this. Maybe that's what the local jurisdiction does. But I just didn't see it written in here, and that was what was concerning to me. Like, you use what's readily available if you don't want to go in, and I'm definitely not
a fan of dogpiling anybody in a situation, so.
I can see you have I'd also
Well,
like to comment, but go ahead and.
Yeah,
finish.
and we're going round and round, and I mean, there's an argument to be made that the best way to prevent abuses is to keep pepper spray out of the facilities, and that makes a lot of sense. I just don't think we progressed to the point of consensus among all the stakeholders where we could accomplish that. We certainly couldn't accomplish it within the ESC, given the probation voices, and they had some very compelling statements, and echoed by Jerry Powers, about a tool that they need to stop something worse from happening. So until we can get beyond that with a substitute plan for de-escalating and controlling violence, the consensus for changes isn't there yet. And maybe it will happen in the legislative process. I listened to what Chief Rotolo said. If you take this out of the package, you take out how we went down the road toward your concern, which is to restrict its use, to document the uses, to make it harder to use, and to put barriers in the way of using pepper spray. So we accomplished that with this round, and that's why I would support adopting the progress that we did make, hoping that we can do more as time goes on.
Mr. Budden.
So I'm definitely torn. I'm moved by the comments of Mr. Powers and Bejarano. I witnessed about a decade ago a really horrible incident where 5 youth threw another youth into a wall head first, and he was paralyzed from the neck down. And the 5 youth were charged with attempted murder, and obviously that's six lives that were ruined from that incident. And so I don't know if someone had OC spray, would that have been stopped beforehand? Maybe, maybe not. I do know that we're only, I think there's 5 states that's used pepper spray in juvenile facilities. There's 45 states that don't use pepper spray in juvenile facilities. And I haven't gotten much answer to my earlier question about best practices, and maybe there is a study, maybe there's not, but there's something that moved 45 states to move away from pepper spray. I guess my question is on timing, is that if the board adopts this today and then we do a study, and the study shows that this doesn't prevent anything and it leads to a lot of abuses, can we revise that section immediately, or do we have to wait a certain number of years? That's question number 1. And then question number 2 is just moving on to a different topic, but just something I would love an answer for. I got a letter earlier in the week about the grievance process. And I know in Los Angeles, none of the youth nor the parents really trust the grievance process. And I've even seen incidents where a kid has written a grievance and put it in a secure box, and then the staff who that grievance was written about finds out about it within an hour of the kid putting it into the box. So there was some suggestion that there should be an independent agency reviewing the grievance process, or maybe an independent agency and the probation department reviewing it. And Mr. Steinhardt, just wanted to know your thoughts on that, if that was ever in discussion when going over that section.
I think we did discuss and make changes to the grievance procedures, and we tightened them up, but I would have to pull up the reg to the standard to, I'm giving Allison some time to find the change. But
We wouldn't
I
have
mean,
been present in
again,
the work group.
and we point, there are two issues here. One is, what does the minimum standards say? And 2, what do we do about the departures or failures to observe the minimum standards? So I'm sure there's a grievance procedure that's pretty good in here, but when it's not followed, or when a kid files a grievance and then it's suddenly a retaliation, that's not good any more than an abuse of pepper spray beyond the standards is. So that's enforcement and so.
Allison appears to have something here.
So the grievance regulations on page 33 in F1, and I don't have a number of agencies that actually use an outside independent agency to review grievances, but there are some probation offices that do have an ombudsman or an outside oversight body reading grievances. But the way to look at the regulation is to really start with the first level response. And what this grievance process is really intended to do is to empower both youth and the first line of staff to say, hey, I have a problem. What can you do to help me to fix that problem? And then there's provisions inside the grievance procedure to then move up if the youth isn't able to have their grievance resolved. And there's steps. And again, with any process and procedure, you need to have, checks and balances to make sure that it's working properly. But ultimately, the top of the line with the grievance procedure is with the chief probation officer. And again, if there's still an inability to resolve a conflict, then maybe it's not a grievance. It could be, some sort of incident or other sort of response where there would be action to be taken, citizens complaint form or other processes within the probation department. But the grievance procedure that is in regulation is really intended to start with communication and, hey, I have a problem as a young person and you're the person I see on a day-to-day basis. How can we work that out? And in fact, in the grievance regulation, there's an expectation that before a piece of paper is filed, that the youth and the staff member there's an attempt to work it out. So at a point, it really is about empowerment and communication, and then steps built in to protect if there is a larger issue.
And what about the second question or the first question, which was about if we find out from a study that the pepper spray is, when can we go back and revise?
Well, I think we can do it piece by piece, I suspect.
Sometimes we have to, if I may.
Yeah, we can, I mean, we can,
Legislation often has encouraged us to change a reg. So, I mean, there are other methods. And I want to, push back a bit to say that the discussion that we're having here today is one that I think was very vigorous and well addressed during the process of this executive steering committee. And so as we move forward, I think the board can direct staff to further investigate alternatives and best practices. And I think that best practice conversation is difficult to have today because, as you and I both know, best practices are somewhat loosely defined. And as we even look at the data across the country, I have different numbers than you do on who is using it and who is not. And so I don't want to make decisions now based on sort of a loosely informed conversation, not to be insulting to anybody that's raising these issues, but to continue to rely on what staff, this executive steering committee, and the many, many people that worked on those subcommittees has brought to us today. So I steadfastly try to remain behind this recommendation by staff. And I would be very open to the board continuing the conversation with further research and a nationwide study.
And I just wanted to clarify one thing. I mean, I deal all the time with people coming out of these facilities and integrating themselves back into their communities. 90% of the time, the conversation with these young people are, this probation officer changed my life. 90% of the time. And we have probation officers in LA County. I had 8 of them at my house and we all barbecued last week, that are just the most transformative, unbelievable people that deeply care about these kids. But I also have walked into a bathroom watching an adult female having sex with a minor. I have one member of ARC whose probation officer had his child, and now they're raising a child together while he was in juvenile hall. And I hear the stories of the abuses by a very small few. And to me, all I'm looking at is how to prevent those abuses.
Right, and I would respond to that by saying there isn't one of us on this board or in this room that hasn't experienced personnel on our staff doing things that are egregious, unacceptable, and disheartening. As I sit next to the Secretary of Corrections and look around at elected sheriffs and police chiefs and probation chiefs, I can tell you none of us like those stories, but we cannot regulate to prohibit bad employees on the job. What we do is we part ways. We work very hard to either have them prosecuted for these kinds of behaviors or make sure that they no longer work in our industry. And so You know, I know every one of us, as you mentioned, these stories are, you know, thinking of instances in our own careers that are really troubling. With that said, that is not the majority of conduct you see by peace officers in the state of California. And I'd like to continue to honor that, move forward with this reg, and promise more study.
I would just like to add to that, you know, and we did have a lot of conversation, and there was conversation in the work group. And it's hard to hear as a chief sometimes, you know, some of these stories. I don't know of one probation chief currently that would tolerate in any way misconduct like that. And with them being made aware of it, there are ways of dealing with that. And I am confident that they would deal with that if they were aware of it. You know, when talking about the pepper spray issue, it's a difficult one. When we go to get trained for that, we're also sprayed, and we're sprayed because we want our staff to be aware of what it feels like. I don't believe that staff want to spray anyone. I don't think that it's, for the most part, and there's going to be people who, you know, abuse the rules. But I don't think they want to spray anyone. It's not a pleasant experience for them either. We have many situations where, you know, it's our obligation to protect everybody. And sometimes the kid that's being, that's in the fight is not a mutual participant in that. They're being attacked. And the only way to stop that immediately and to avoid further harm is either the threat of, and I have seen many fights stopped with saying, stop or you're going to get pepper sprayed, and they stop, or having to spray them. But I just want to reiterate that I don't believe that it's something that probation staff want to do. It is a tool to use when necessary to stop the violence immediately and to avoid further harm. So, you know, with that, I'd like to make a motion to approve the recommendations that were made through the ESC for the first part of this.
We have a motion.
So I appreciate all of the input from everyone on the board. I just have a quick question. So part of what I was hoping or looking for with all of the extra talk that I gave was already struck out by some of the more subject matter experts. So I'm just wondering, like, can that be added or why it was taken out? So the section that I was really, the point I was trying to make was having, and that's in B.
What page are you on?
Page 29 towards the bottom in the B section, where they took out the part about basically having a system for investigation of use of force and administrative review. So I'm not saying that.
Hang on just a minute.
Oh, I'm not saying that it completely that there isn't a need or a use, but I think that there should be some process to review when it's used, and I didn't see that in here. So that was what was mostly concerning.
So if you look over on page 28, what we did is we took that from the back end of the regulation and we actually moved it up to its own section in 6 on page 28 under A6. Because there was an agreement amongst the executive steering committee and the work group members that it shouldn't be buried in the end of a long paragraph. It was actually moved up into the beginning body of the regulation, that it applies to all uses of force, of which chemical agents is one of those.
So that would have saved me about 20 minutes of grief because I kept saying, why'd they take it
I
out?
know,
Like, that's so important. Okay, well, then I'm good.
Okay, so any further comment? Oh, we have well, you don't have to comment then, just go ahead and second.
I'll second that.
So we have a motion and a second. All in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed?
Opposed.
Abstained? Motion carries. Thank you all. Great discussion. Allison's still there. And Allison, I want to close by saying, you know, you are spectacularly informed and an expert, and your staff has done some incredible heavy lifting. I think by your gregarious smile, often people think, well, you know, what she got packed in the suitcase, and I'll tell you, you're an expert. We are, well, I have the same rap, so I get you. So I just want to tell you, your expertise has carried us, as illustrated 2 seconds ago when you were able to clear up a murky subject. So I appreciate all you've done and all that your staff has done.
Yeah, it's definitely my my team as well. They're passing me notes and sending me things as we go along. So I couldn't do it without them for sure.
Yes, and now we're going to, for the sake of humanity, take a 5-minute break. And
Thank
I
you,
mean
Madam
5 minutes. Okay, everybody please take a seat, take a seat. We are, we're pressing up against, I'm going to ask the group to quiet down. Please take a seat. Please take a seat.
There you go.
Go! We're pressing up against flight schedules, and so I really want to get rolling and give adequate amount of time to the rest of the agenda. And moving it. Thank you all. Thank you all. Allison's back in place.
Hang on. Nobody's gone.
So as we approach item 2, tab F summarizes the options for the executive steering committee, from the executive steering committee.
Madam Chair, can I make that process comment before you go into the substance, please?
Yes.
You mentioned that public comment would be limited to 2 minutes. Now, we had some preliminary planning discussions with the staff, and where's Co-Chair Brown? And we had agreed on 3 minutes for this issue for a couple of reasons. It comes to the board de novo because the ESC could not come to agreement on it. It involves multiple options. And we have speakers here who've come a long way to address those options. And so I would ask that we honor the 3-minute limit rather than a 2-minute limit for this item as it is initial before the board. And I mean, it might add 10 minutes total to the process of the day.
I will tell you that I'm concerned. I think every item this board discusses is important. I'm worried that we're bumping up against flight schedules, and I do not want to lose members of the board. Does that at all change your thoughts?
How many cards do we have?
16 cards.
Okay. I mean, I admit that's a lot, and we did agree that if it was pushing 20, we would have to cut it. How about,
and I guess
2.5?
I was left out of that agreement. I was
Can I
left
get
out of that
2.5?
agreement. If, all right, we're going to go forward with 2. I'm very concerned about running out of board members, and so I'm going to go forward with 2. I apologize, I wasn't in the agreement circle, and I think that the last half of this discussion was important, and we did it with 2 minutes, and so I'm hopeful that we can continue down that track. Any other board members want to be heard on that?
2.5.
I'm happy to do 2.5 if we need to hit 2.5.
The iPhone software has been updated to include half minutes, so.
All right, we're gonna 2.5 in the, as we reach consensus, we're hitting 2.5. All right, thank you, Allison. Okay, process questions have been answered, and I'm gonna ask you to,
I have 2.5.
Allison, you get a little more, wait a minute, what's this? Well, you look at the secretary. Oh, yeah. Okay, that wasn't right. Okay.
So for background and discussion on section 1321 staffing, which is the regulation that, among other requirements, sets the minimum youth supervision staff to youth ratio in juvenile detention facilities. The administration work group was originally assigned to revise this regulation, and after extensive discussion was unable to come to consensus. So the work group provided 3 options to the executive steering committee for consideration. Those are before you in attachment F2. The 3 separate options are: page 1, to maintain the current ratios, which are in juvenile halls during hours when youth are awake, 1 to 10, during sleeping hours, 1 to 30, in camps during awake hours, 1 to 15, and sleeping 1 staff to 30 youth. And also, you'll see in there some minor additions to the regulation for clarity. On page 4 is option number 2, which would reduce all juvenile detention facility ratios to 1 to 8 during awake hours and 1 to 16 during sleeping hours, making no distinction between halls and camps. And then on page 6, continuing to keep the reduced ratios, but also allow facilities to apply to the BSCC board for a waiver, a 2-year waiver for staffing ratios, provided that the administrator provides a detailed statement of the circumstances that prevent compliance and propose alternative means for meeting the safety, security, and programmatic needs of the youth. So how did these 3 options come about? Both the work groups and the ESC considered many factors when determining potential revisions to Section 1321. Included in those discussions were the Prison Rape Elimination Act. Those regulations call for a 1 to 8 and a 1 to 16 ratio. The ESC and the work groups discussed keeping the ratios as they are, discussion being that they are minimum standards. Some agencies are already operating with reduced ratios in their counties, but not all agencies can meet that. Could or should agencies be given the opportunity for more time to work toward a lower ratio? And who should be included in that ratio? Should it continue to be youth supervision staff? And as you can see in the extensive public comment before you, there's literature and opinion on where staffing ratios should land and what those best practices are. There's also funding considerations and potential that programs and services could be impacted by a change in ratios. The ESC carefully considered those 3 options and also discussed and offered some additional potential solutions, such as allowing staff other than youth supervision staff to apply to the ratio, meaning teachers, program staff, other staff in the facility, etc. However, it was determined that PREA does not recognize other than child supervision staff to count in the ratio, and this is not the intent of the regulation to expand to other types of staff. Allowing greater flexibility in ratios during the day. For example, when youth are not in their living units, they're in other programs being supervised by other types of staff. Perhaps there could be some flexibility. The ESC also talked about allowing agencies to seek alternative means of compliance to keep higher ratios, even if they are ultimately lowered. And this would allow agencies who received such an alternative to continue to maintain compliance with 1321 at that higher ratio. And the ESC also discussed alternative ratios, maybe 1 to 9 or something similar to that, which would reduce ratios, but perhaps not have as much of an impact on agencies. So you can see there was a lot of discussion. The ESC did discuss this for quite some time. They discussed numerous possible approaches, and what the ESC chose to do was to take a vote on whether or not those ratios should be reduced, and that vote was evenly split. So following this deadlock, the Executive Steering Committee agreed that the board would be presented with these 3 options, which you have before you in F2, and informed of discussions to attempt compromise, those which I've discussed. I would invite the co-chairs to add their thoughts at this time, or to take any questions from the board if there are any.
Can I make mine first, David? Because this is going to be quick. Thank you. I almost feel like I need to apologize for not being able to resolve this at the ESC level and having to bring it here. But I can assure you that there was extensive, robust conversation, both at the work group level and then at the ESC. And the word I think I used during the ESC meeting was hung jury. You get to the point where you just realize that you're not going to move past having this split, and it's time to take it to whatever the next level was, which is here. So I just want to say I'm going to refrain from any in-depth comments and let the speakers have an opportunity, because I think probably most of the things I would have to say are going to be addressed by someone else. I do want to say, though, that at this point in time, I am in favor of option 1, which is to leave it alone. And I'll leave it at that.
And I don't have any extensive comments now. I'm going to wait and hear the public comment, and then I have some comments I want to make. We were unable to come to agreement, and it was a conspiracy of circumstances, including late in the day, some members having left the meeting, fatigue, competing interests. And so here it is before the full board as essentially a new item. I'm a option 3 fan, alternatives and waiver. I'm going to explain that later on. That's all I have for now.
Anything from board members, other board members?
Sure, if you don't mind. Similar argument to the OC spray. I'm not aware of any research or data that supports 10 or even 8. So I don't see any research that shows us that 8 is going to be a safer for kids. I'd like to see that information if it's there, but I'm not aware of any. And as a representative for small counties, I think I speak for a few at least, that if this were to change to 8-1, there's probably a much stronger chance that Nevada County would not have a juvenile hall. We would probably send our kids down the hill to Placer County. Different demographic there, big concern about visiting. I would not have control over Skype. And I can pretty much bet that my parents aren't going to make the hour-long trip down to their juvenile hall. So I think you would lose some family reunification opportunities. Yeah, so those are my main points, and so I would be supporting option 1.
Anything else on the board?
Are we going to get an opportunity after the public?
Yes.
Oh, wait. I wanna hear that.
Chief Rotolo, I'm sorry. Very compelling question. In that situation, in option 3, couldn't you apply for a waiver being a small county? And wouldn't that solve your problem?
I believe it's only a 2-year waiver, and I'm on the verge of, I'm doing everything I can to keep my juvenile hall because I believe serving our youth locally is the best thing we can do. So again, this would probably push it to the other side.
Okay, how many comments?
16, Chair.
I believe we have settled on
2.5
2.5 minutes.
All right, I will call you up 3 at a time. Chief John Keene, Sue Burrell, and Chief Mary Butler.
Let me indicate, regardless of what time, you do not have to use all 2.5 minutes. Throw that out there in the woods for consideration.
So why'd you start with that when you saw what's
It wasn't right.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the board. My name is John Keene. I'm the Chief Probation Officer in San Mateo County. I've been fortunate to work in the field of probation for 20 years, serving as chief for the past 5. As chief, there are many considerations that hold my focus on a daily basis. The safety and security of our youth in our care and the staff that work with those youth are in my top priorities. In conjunction with this concern for safety also comes my interest in positively impacting the lives of those we serve. Anything that negatively impacts the youth in our care, I consider counterintuitive to that mission. I'm here today to speak in opposition for any revisions that propose to change current staffing ratios. I fully support the letter that CPOC has submitted to the board that goes into more detail about the many reasons why we believe that a change to staffing ratios will be ill-advised at this time. I specifically want to speak today to you about how probation has dedicated itself as an industry over the past decade to institute evidence-based practices within our halls, camps, ranches as well, and to suggest that staffing changes could have a negative impact on those successful programs we have been able to offer. Probation departments have gone to great lengths to institute assessments, evidence-based practices to ensure that the youth we serve have the best possible services while they're in our facilities. We have implemented many evidence-based programs focusing on behavior and cognitive needs of youth, mental health, substance abuse and treatment, education, vocational, as well as many other items to benefit those young folks. Further, staffing operations within our facilities also are represented by people who have been fully trained in many of the latest research and training practices in working with young people today. You have heard today about many upgrades to programs within the Title 15 regulations. I was very fortunate enough to serve on that subcommittee, and I'm very proud of what we were able to do at that time. However, the permanent reduction in staffing ratios could be a potential detriment to the successful rehabilitative programs that you heard about today. For all the progress California has made in ensuring that juvenile facilities are focused on evidence-based practices and rehabilitation and treatment, I and many of my fellow chiefs believe that potential revisions would be a major step backwards. Lowering staffing ratios will, by its very nature, move resources away from prevention, intervention, and programming in many of our facilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You know about the 2.5? Sue, sorry to cut off 30 seconds, but good to see you again.
No, I practiced for 3. So I want to make 3 points. And I should say by way of background that I worked for 28 years at the Youth Law Center. And in that time, I was a lawyer in institutional litigation. I trained juvenile professionals all over the country. I helped to write national standards. And I've been in dozens of facilities around the country. And what I can say is that understaffing is one of the primary issues that gets facilities into trouble. So point 1 I want to make is it is the accepted national standard. It's in the handouts that you have in front of you. Our own Corrections Independent Review Panel said to Governor Schwarzenegger in 2004 that 1 to 8 was the accepted standard, and it was recommended that we adopt it in state facilities. It's the PREA standard, it's the Department of Justice standard. And what this means is that if somebody gets into trouble, if they get sued, this is the standard that will be applied. And so point 1 is the Board of State and Community Corrections should not acquiesce in a standard that does not protect California counties against liability. Point 2, things have changed. These 1 to 10 standards were adopted a long time ago. And in recent years, staff have so many more responsibilities. After realignment, they have a higher profile of youth for a longer period in juvenile facilities. There are more kids with mental health issues and suicidal youth who need one-on-one care. They have duties to provide trauma-informed care, positive behavior management. You have it. They are much more engaged, and they need to be able to have the time to work with kids and also to head off problems. And the third issue I want to address is that an argument is being put forward that if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and there aren't any problems. And that simply is not true. In the materials you have in your big notebook, I included a number of problems that I Googled and just found, on just a superficial search of the internet about things going on. There are cases where staff wasn't able to head off a suicide in a facility, where staff wasn't able to prevent sexual abuse, an incident where staff, can I have like 1 minute? Okay.
No, you can't have 1 minute. But you
Okay,
can wind
where
it up.
anyway, it's just false to say that there aren't problems. And the other thing is that in this language that we went, and I'm going for option 3, we already made an adjustment to allow supervisory staff to be counted in the staffing ratios when they are supervising, when they're acting as childcare staff. I think that will help the smaller counties, and I think we should provide an alternative, but not dumb down the standard.
Thank you, Sue.
Just before you start to speak, I'd like to call up Bill Damiano, Darby Kernan, and Luis Dominguez.
Good morning, Madam Chair and board members. My name is Mary Butler. I am the Chief Probation Officer in Napa County and have been for 15 years. However, I've worked for Napa County for over 30, and in my previous roles, I was the Child Welfare Director and the Mental Health Director who was involved in the building of our current juvenile hall facility that was built and designed as a treatment facility, and I might add, designed with the 1 to 10 ratio. I am here to speak in opposition of any revision to the proposed that we change those current staffing ratios. First and foremost, safety and security of the youth we serve and our staff is a primary goal of all the chief probation officers. But one reason I'm here to talk about this staffing ratio issue is there is no research that shows that 1 to 8 does anything different than 1 to 10. I hear that it may be a standard, but in other places, but what I have not heard is anything that ties that standard to any validated research that has been done in the state of California. Chief Keen talked about our use of evidence-based practices. That has been a key in juvenile probation departments across the state, and all of that is predicated on using what works and what works in California and what works in our local facilities. Much like a risk assessment tool, we would need to validate any research locally. Right now, we have not seen any research that has been done that shows that 1 to 8 makes a facility safer than 1 to 10. What we have seen with this in our move to evidence-based practices with our current staffing ratios, we have had tremendous success over the past 10 years, reducing not only juvenile incarceration rates, but juvenile arrest rates. With no evidence proving there are systematic safety and welfare concerns in California's juvenile institutions that need to be addressed, and no research showing that lower staffing ratio is the solution to address those problems if they did exist, the adoption of an overburdensome and costly staffing ratio would be short-sighted and would be a detriment to the youth we serve. Thank you.
Chair and Board, Bill Damiano, Chief Probation Officer for Humboldt County. 29 plus years in probation, almost 8 years as chief in the county. In case you don't know, Humboldt is a remote, small, poor, rural county. First, I want to say that we have a deep commitment to the safety, support, and protection from harm of all of the youth in our care. We go to extensive training with our staff to make sure that they are prepared to deal with the issues that are brought to us with these extremely complex youth with histories of trauma, separation, isolation, and various forms of abuse. We've been able to, under the current staffing ratios, put programs into place that address a lot of those issues, and we're getting better outcomes, not just with youth, but with families. The shift in staffing ratios would undoubtedly impact that in my small county. We have limited funding. There's no extra funding. The additional staffing required to meet the 1 to 8 ratio would equate to about $250,000. That would come at the cost of either programming or, much in the case of Chief Ertola's county, the closing of potentially of our juvenile hall. We are 2 to 4 hours away from any other nearby juvenile hall. We have 2-lane highways through dangerous mountain roads with various kinds of weather conditions, and that the children would be put into a safety concern, as well as being separated from contact with their families and other community supports. I think that any kind of change in the staffing ratio is going to have a significant impact, not just on the families, on the kids, but our ability to continue the great work that we've been doing in our county in employing evidence-based practices, cognitive behavioral interventions, and family supports to try and keep these families together and get positive outcomes for these youth. So please consider option 1. It doesn't need to change at this point. The minimum standard is working for us, and we do staff up when we have extraordinary circumstances in our halls when necessary. But mandating it every day is going to be problematic for small counties. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Darby Kernan. I'm with the California State Association of Counties. We are here to oppose any changes in the staffing ratios and support option 1. I think what you're hearing from the rural counties is how budgets are very tight, but it is not just rural counties that have tight budgets. It's the economic recovery has not been statewide. And so counties like Riverside and San Bernardino are still struggling to make sure that they can have the funding to do what they're currently doing. If these changes are put into place, there is definitely not going to be an increase in programming and evidence-based practices. What will happen is with the existing budget, they will have to make do and add custodial staff, including retirement costs, and cut programming and evidence-based practices that are helping the youth so that they're not recidivating and entering our adult systems. So we oppose this change and think that the current system, until there is more research and data, should stay the same. Thank you.
Mark Hake, please come up, Virginia Corrigan, and Brian Goldstein.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and BSCC board members. My name is Luis Dominguez, LA County Probation. I'm here on behalf of Chief Terry McDonald, who regrets she could not attend today due to other pressing matters, but she asked me to read a statement on her behalf. I apologize I could not join my colleagues today to personally voice my opposition to any revisions to the current minimum staffing ratios reflected in the existing Title 15. Prior to becoming the probation chief in Los Angeles, I spent over 35 years working in mental health treatment facilities, drug treatment centers, and working within and overseeing some of the most complex correctional systems in America. After several years working in behavioral health treatment systems, I had the extreme honor of serving 25 years with the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. As the Undersecretary of Operations, responsible for executive oversight of both the adult and juvenile systems. Most recently, I served as Assistant Sheriff in Los Angeles County, where I was tasked with a major reform of the county jails to address critical issues such as rehabilitative programming, access to care, reentry services, use of force, and institutional safety protocols. In my executive roles with the State Sheriff's Department and now probation, I have been and currently responsible for the safety of the facilities and the people who live and work in them, as well as the implementation of PREA protocols within those systems. I will be remiss not to say how seriously the chiefs and I take the issue of sexual assaults or any harm to our youth under our care. I also respect the desire behind the concept of reducing mandated ratios, but need to state unequivocally that reduced ratios are not steeped in evidence-based or well-established correctional practices. The ratios, while well-intentioned, do not take into consideration the myriad of decisions that go into establishing staffing patterns to create a safe environment. Staffing levels, as our partners from the state system can attest, are driven by the physical plan design, the acuity or classification of the group supervised in the area, the support staffing to assist with the program model, such as therapists, teachers, social workers, and the overall program model. Correctional experts across the nation rely on a complex set of factors to establish staffing levels to ensure safety in the facility, and no recognized expert would establish a one-size-fits-all staffing approach across jurisdictions. Because of my experience in developing and overseeing a broad range of programs and associated staffing patterns in several systems, I fully support the letter submitted from the Chief Probation Officers of California to the board outlining important explanations concerning how staffing ratio reduction will be detrimental to our juvenile institutions and the youth we serve in those institutions.
I hope she says sincerely yours.
In my experience, it's more important that we are looking at a system as a system as a whole. Yeah, I'm closing. Okay, as a system rather than one arbitrary part of the system. There is not a zero-sum proposition. The unfunded regulatory mandate forcing down staffing ratios will come at a no cost to other critical systems that will now contribute to trauma-informed, safety-focused program designed to reduce recidivism by targeting the individual needs of those in our charge. The funds needed to comply will come from training funds, program provision funds, and other programs. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the board. I was prepared for 3 minutes. I got here, learned that it was 2 minutes, so I edited my remarks, and now I'm confused about what to do with 2.5 minutes.
Good luck.
But in the interest of time, we'll go with the 2-minute version. My name is Mark Hake, and I'm the Chief Probation Officer of Riverside County. I've been the chief for 5 years, and I started my career in probation nearly 29 years ago as a probations corrections officer at Riverside Juvenile Hall. I can tell you without hesitation that for chief probation officers, our first responsibility, and that which keeps most of us up some nights, is the welfare of youth in our facilities. We respect and feel the full weight of that responsibility as we are actually caring for somebody else's child, and that's a heavy weight. And alongside of us, the BSCC also has a great responsibility, and that is to inspect and certify our juvenile facilities. We work together to ensure our institutions are safe, rehabilitative, and accountable. Your board sets our regulations and we implement them. The regulations you set per statute are the minimum regulations needed to ensure a safe and secure local detention facility. We know that for institutions to run smoothly, effectively, and safely, we need well-trained juvenile hall and camp staff, as well as valuable programming. Regulations require staff to be well trained before they start their first shift and require ongoing training annually going forward. I know in Riverside County, my staff worked diligently to ensure we review the recommendations of BSCC inspectors and discuss our biennial reviews internally to ensure we are operating at our best. Any abuse is uncalled for, and we strive to ensure youth in Riverside County are safe and secure while under our care. To my knowledge, BSCC staff have not found anywhere in California evidence of negligence, concerns for youth well-being, or gaps in care that might lead one to be physically, emotionally, or sexually abused, whether that abuse be at the hands of staff or another youth. BSCC provides updates to the chiefs from across California regularly, and this has not been identified as an issue in our institutions. As such, I caution against the using an arbitrary number of staff to youth ratio to equate to a safe environment. It is the training new and existing employees receive. It is the healthy relationships that are built with our youth and the programming the youth receive that make for a safe and secure facility. It's for this reason, as well as the reasons outlined in the letter you received from the Chief Probation Officers of California, that I oppose changing the staffing ratios beyond their current status. Thank you.
Thank you.
Virginia Corrigan, Staff Attorney at Youth Law Center. I'll be brief. Sorry. I don't need all 2.5. I will be brief. The Youth Law Center urges the board to adopt option 2 or as fallback option 3, incorporating the PREA staffing ratio requirement into the regulations. This change is in fact overdue. Juvenile facilities must take the steps necessary to protect youth from sexual abuse and harassment. Adequate staffing is one of the most crucial protections that facilities can provide. It increases staff's ability to detect signs of victimization and to intervene to prevent abuse from occurring. PREA ratios are based on careful consideration at the national level, and they represent accepted professional standards nationwide. The failure to adopt these standards leaves facilities vulnerable to liability and youth vulnerable to victimization. So we would urge option 2 or 3.
Hang on one second, Brian. Dominique Nong, Israel Villa, Dario Soto, and Rosie McCool, please.
Good afternoon, Brian Goldstein with the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice. I just want to start by revisiting a point I'd made earlier, which is that there is evidence of challenging issues within local juvenile facilities, as evidenced by 300 plus respondents to a public comment survey that BSCC has collected and distributed. These systemic issues, coupled with mountains of research which show the impact of staffing ratios, should lead the BSCC board to adopt the 1:8 and 1:16 ratios. Ratios that are adopted as part of PREA, that have been adopted by 300 plus jurisdictions who are part of the Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative. These regulations, the recommendations before the board, are certainly about protecting young people from violence and sexual assault. But California doesn't have to make a choice between programming and security. We think this is arguably a false choice. Waiver option number 3 allows small counties to address this cost issue. Counties can also leverage state juvenile justice funding from the Juvenile Justice Crime Prevention Act and Youthful Offender Block Grant, millions of dollars, which has grown annually despite historic lows in juvenile arrests and facility population numbers. This is an opportunity for California to join with nationally recognized standards and best practices to best protect young people. We hope the board makes that choice today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Dominique Nong from the Children's Defense Fund, California. With all the debate going on today and prior to today's meeting, I fear that the origin of these ratios and their purpose is getting lost. The purpose of these ratios is to end the unacceptable sexual assault of our youth in our facilities. I hope I don't have to take the time to explain the depth and the breadth of the trauma and harms that come from a sexual assault. And I believe that everyone here would agree that one sexual assault of any youth in our facilities is one too many. We could also agree that the risk of sexual victimization is a reality in all settings that house youth. And it's a reality that cannot responsibly be denied. In 2008, there was a national survey of youth in custody, and over 1 in 8 youth reported being victims of sexual assault. In 2008, 4,300 youth were estimated to be victims of the most serious forms of sexual abuse while they were in custody, including forcible rape and other non-consensual sexual acts involving injury, force, or high incidence. And so in recognition of this harsh reality, leaders decided to confront this by creating the National Prison Rape Elimination Commission that was established to carry out a comprehensive legal and factual study of the penological, physical, mental, medical, social, and economic impacts of prison rape, broadly defined to include juvenile facilities and a lot of unwanted sexual activity. And there were over 4 years of work, of panels, of investigations, of consultations with law enforcement. And we're being asked, in over 4 years of work, they came out with these standards for the detection, prevention, and reduction of sexual assault. And staffing ratios were only one of those many standards put forth. And there's been questions about research about 1 to 8 and 1 to 10. During these deliberations in which the department considered a number of competing considerations, including budget constraints, they created a regulatory impact assessment and still decided that the cost of compliance balanced out and outweighed the cost of victimization. They looked at 1 to 4, they considered 1 to 6, 1 to 8, 1 to 10, 1 to 12, 1 to 16. They considered a range far more than we're talking about today. And they came up as a minimum floor of 1 to 8. I'm not sure what more the opposition can reasonably ask for in terms of a close examination. But what I do know, and I agree with opposition, is that staffing ratios alone are not the answer. The ratios are only one component of an entire approach to protecting youth from sexual misconduct. Staffing ratios complement other measures like staff training, youth education, classification, searching, and other reporting mechanisms. I would just like to close by saying today, I believe that the opposition has created a false choice. We shouldn't have to choose between protecting our young people from rape and programming. If we fail to protect our young people, if we fail to protect our young people and continue to allow them to be victimized and traumatized by sexual assault, no amount of programming will rehabilitate them.
Good afternoon. My name is Dario Soto. I'm with the grassroots organization, nonprofit known as MILPA, Motivating Individual Leadership for Public Advancement. I am formerly incarcerated most of my adolescent life. I grew up in the system. First time I shaved was in the system. Not very proud to say that, but it has shaped me into who I am today. And a lot of the trauma and experiences I still carry with me. Due to that, I'm also very passionate about doing the youth work that I do, and sharing my experiences with them to help them choose better pathways to success. So with that, I can remember times when I was incarcerated, going to juvenile hall and then youth authority, that there were times where there wasn't enough staff, so we were kept on our bunks. A lot of the times that caused a lot of frustration. The youth started to argue with themselves, and then once program would open up, we would start fighting. Another thing that I have seen due to low staff is movements. So we weren't able to go anywhere. We were in-house activities. If that day room, we weren't allowed to go out to the yard to play basketball. They had a pool there. Nobody was ever taken to the pool to go swimming. A lot of recreational activities that were missed out on. Another thing, coming in juvenile hall at age 14, 12, 15, a lot of times these youth are virgins. And so they're still exploring a lot of their sexuality. And there is a lot of sexual assaults that go unreported. Young men especially, very embarrassed, don't want to say anything about it, but these things do happen. And it's constantly happening. It's a lot of manipulation going on. A lot of times there's nobody supervising due to that these things transpire. And so with that, I just want to leave some real life experiences, things that really go on that I have seen with my own eyes, and share that experience with you. And hopefully this helps in your decision. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. Israel Villa with Milpa. Also here to advocate and ask for consideration for either the second or third option. I don't understand, but I know that there's huge concern with raising the staff ratio is gonna be about money, budgets, financial implications. However, I think that throughout my 17+ years of incarceration, the most common thing that I've heard from staff was due to safety and security of the institution, safety and security of the staff, the inmates, the youth, so on and so forth. Like my colleague was saying, for not taking us to rec, there's not enough staff. We can't take you today, so on and so forth. I know also from personal, lots of years of experience that there is an abundance of assaults that take place. Fortunately, I myself have never been assaulted nor committed such assault, but I have witnessed, I have seen with my very own eyes, numerous sexual assaults of little kids, of young boys, older boys on younger boys, so on and so forth. And majority of it does not go report, but it's definitely happened. I support a research or study on it, and I could guarantee I could find some folks who fit that criteria. But the bottom line is I do feel that the staff ratio should be increased. I know the chemical spray argument is over here, but even that would alone could solve that issue as well. If there was adequate amount of staff, we would not need no chemical agents. And again, I think it is in our children's best interest to have adequate staffing. And I hope that the right decision is made. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and board members. Rosie McColl with the Chief Probation Officers of California. I just want to emphasize before I begin that chiefs, probation chiefs, the Chief Probation Officers, along with all of us in this room, all of us listening today who are streaming it on the internet, we're all opposed to any sexual assault, physical, verbal harm that can be done to any youth or any person for that matter. However, we aren't aware of any systemic problem that necessitates lowering the staffing ratio within California. The BSCC's purview is to set minimum standards for the operation of juvenile facilities, inspect our facilities. Chiefs dedicate their careers to assisting youth and adults in changing their lives through rehabilitative services and ensuring accountability. Furthermore, the running of a juvenile facility is a chief's greatest responsibility, as they are responsible for the well-being of the youth under their care and supervision. They take this role very seriously. They are the people that have to call the parents of these youth should something happen to them. Many chiefs are here today to show how much they care about their youth, their staff, and the institutions they operate across California. Institutions are more than just ratios. One skim through all the proposed changes in the regulations today reflects the sincerity of their work, the commitment to ensuring that the regulations reflect best practice and maintain an environment that allows chiefs the ability to operate institutions focused on rehabilitation and youth success. Institutions are about the youth that are living within them and the staff that supervise them and care for them. These staff are well-trained, and in fact, the regulations today reflect an update to that training. Institutions are about the programs and services that chiefs are able to provide and offer the probation youth that are reflective of the needs of the youth and the communities they come from. Juvenile institutions are about detaining only those youth in need of detention, which means that the youth we are serving have been assessed as a risk to reoffend that requires the youth to be in the facility, and oftentimes these youth are high need. Juvenile institutions are about restoring and promoting familial relationships, with some probation departments will be challenged to do if they are forced to close their facility and send youth to another facility farther away. It is the totality of a facility, the quality staff that come to work each day dedicated to help our youth, and the regulations that are before you that make facilities safe and successful. It is the programming offered within the institutions and the connections to the community and family engagement that make for safe institutions and lead to successful youth. For all these reasons, CPOC and the Chief Probation Officers across California, we respectfully urge you to maintain current staffing ratios of 1 to 10 awake hours in halls, 1 to 15 awake hours in camps, and 1 to 30 sleeping hours in camps and halls. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all the cards I have.
Now we'll return back to the board looking for additional comments.
A couple comments. Do you know what the best chief probation officer's job in the state of California is? The San Francisco adult chief probation officer. Because he doesn't have a juvenile hall, and I would reflect that as a former chief probation officer. There are many sleepless nights or interrupted nights because of the responsibility of running a juvenile hall. So I can tell you that no one takes it lightly, and it is one of the most significant burdens for a chief probation officer, if not the most. And anybody who's had a suicide in their facility or a serious assault will tell you that they take that very personally. This is a fiscal issue. I mean, let's put it out there where it is. To drop staffing ratios, you have to look at the history of construction of facilities in California, juvenile facilities. Facilities were constructed on tens. Units were 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s, the bed ratios. When we drop to 8, or as the proposal would be to drop to 8 beds per, to staff a 20-bed facility, you go from 2 staff to 3 staff. So it's not simply just a 20% reduction. In some instances, it's a 50% or more increase in the staffing requirements. And that doesn't address the increases in the camps that they have in those ratios. So you have facility issues. The facilities that are designed today, I designed 2 facilities, one in Stanislaus and one in Los Angeles. They were designed on 10s. And so as much as we'd like to say that money shouldn't drive it, you will see a significant impact if you drop from 10 to 1 to 8 to 1 in reductions in programs or reductions in beds. That's really what you're gonna talk about. I certainly understand the PREA standards. I understand what we talk about as national standards. To echo Chief Hurtola's, I don't know that dropping from 10 to 8, that any of us could say definitively that will reduce sexual assaults, that it will reduce things that happen inside of the rooms that these kids are in. We have other policies that BSCC has, regulations with respect to how frequently we do room checks and things like that, that probably have as much, if not more, of an impact on the safety of the kids within those rooms. I think that we have to go back to the discussion that we had with the pepper spray. We're talking about a minimum standard here. When I was in Los Angeles, we had the Department of Justice who came in and had some significant sway in how we staffed our facilities and things like that because of misconduct in the facilities. And the Board of Supervisors bid off a significant fiscal chunk of money to increase the staffing ratios in those facilities. I spent 3 hours 2 weeks ago with an attorney from Los Angeles County because of misconduct post the increased staffing ratios. So increasing staffing does not necessarily mean that you're not going to have misconduct on the part of staff, that you're not going to have sexual assault in your facilities. It's training, it's the selection of quality staff, it's the entire picture. So I think we have to be careful to not feel like if we simply just change the staffing ratio that all of a sudden our facilities are going to be completely safe and that we won't have those issues. I would push back against that strenuously. And I don't think the design that we have today supports that. Frankly, as a superintendent of a juvenile hall, one of the things that used to bug me or that used to aggravate me was the fact that we had ratios in individual units, that it wasn't overall entire facility. So I couldn't redeploy staff to units that were more problematic because it meant I went under ratio in another unit. So maybe discussion for the future would be to look at ratios for the entire facility and give the facility managers the ability to put more staff in a unit that is a needier unit or has a higher treatment intensity requirement versus other staffs. But the regulations didn't allow that and don't allow that at this point. So I'm going to go for you're shocked, I'm sure. I'm going to go for option
1. Oh, voice. So we're really caught here between competing arguments and needs. So on the one side, California is unarguably out of compliance with the PREA staffing standard and with the national standards for staffing recognized by outfits that should know what they're talking about, the Council of Juvenile Correctional Administrators, the National Institute of Corrections. On the other hand, we've heard very compelling concerns expressed by probation about the impact of mandating a tighter standard, a higher ratio of staff to youth, both on cost uh, on services. I'm just troubled by the fact that we have to choose between the two, not adopting the best practice standard that's nationally recognized on the one hand, or forcing consequences for probation and the management of facilities that are unacceptable on the other. And so this is why I tried in our ESC proceedings, and I'm still trying to find a middle ground. And I think that that middle ground is option 3, the waiver provision. And the waiver provision, it's not fully packaged. It's more a concept. I don't know that we could adopt it today, even if it had voting support in this group. But what it would do is it would acknowledge the national standard of 1 to 8 and 1 to 15 or 16 versus 1 to 30 at night. We don't talk so much about the nighttime discrepancy, which is large. But it would require the Board of State and Community Corrections, as it does in other practice areas, to review requests from counties to operate at a different staffing level based on compelling county circumstances, as long as there was a documentation that the safety and security of the facility could be maintained. So waiver was one option that made this possible. Adopt the standard in principle, allow counties to do what they need to do based on BSCC approval. And a secondary path for doing that we discussed was amending Section 1304, alternate means of compliance, which also carves out a path to do something a little differently than what the basic standard might allow. These proposals for waiver and alternate means of compliance were were complicated by legal concerns that council began to describe. Is a waiver a minimum standard or not? I mean, there is an issue there. Is it enforceable when you have a standard and then a departure from the standard, even if approved by BSCC? So I have to acknowledge that waiver is not a finished discussion in terms of its legality. Still, I support it in principle. And I pointed to also in our discussions other areas where, for example, we have Section 208.5 of the Welfare and Institutions Code that allows BSCC to approve holding kids who are older than 18, 19, 20, and 21 in a facility beyond the statutory limit, so long as the facility can guarantee the safety and the programming and so on. And there are other examples. So I'm not comfortable with having to pick one side or the other. I like the middle ground. It would need further development. That's where I would like to see us go.
So just want to respond to some of the chiefs here. And you guys are all righteous people and deeply care about kids. And I just want to keep it real in terms of what the issue is here, because I hear a little bit of that safety and security is going to be jeopardized. I've never heard a law enforcement person in my life say that safety and security is going to be jeopardized by more staff. So it's not about safety and security. To be honest with you, the only thing I've seen work in probation to help the people I work with change their lives are relationships with great staff. And if you have more staff to have great relationships with young people, that will change them. In LA County Probation, we have incredible staff that have incredible relationships and great communication. And that is what it takes to get a kid to leave a gang or leave drugs and to go towards a better life. And they all say it's these LA County Probation officers that have changed them. So I think taking away staff and not increasing staff, I don't buy the safety and security reasoning. Every time my program's canceled, it's because of understaffing. So you're not going to have enough programs if you increase the staffing. It's the exact opposite of what I experience every week. Every week, my program's canceled when there's not enough staffing. So I find both of those pretty bogus. And every horrible incident that I've seen happen, as I've relayed here, a kid being paralyzed, sexual abuse, distribution of drugs by staff, All of that happens when there isn't enough supervision and when there's less staff on the units. And let's just talk about what the real reason is here. And the real reason that we have a problem here is money, is that the state is not funding this. And they really should be. If we want to go to these ratios, you guys should get the funding to go to these ratios. I'm very, very, very concerned with the small county argument. I buy it 100%. I get it. I do like option 3, the waiver, and I do think you should be able to get the waiver after 2 years. And if you want to reapply for the waiver, do that. I really see that unless you're going to get a huge influx of funding to go to these ratios, I see why it's impossible. And I may want to move to Humboldt County one day. So it's the most gorgeous place on earth. So I wish we didn't have to choose between the two. I wish this could just be funding and we can go to a 1-to-8 ratio. I think, to me, good things happen to kids when you increase competent, trained, caring staff, and when bad things happen to kids when you decrease that. It's very clear. So none of those arguments work on me, but the fiscal argument, and I thought ex-Chief Powers said it the greatest. I buy that. So I'm going to attempt to amend option 3 to allow counties to reapply for the waiver after 2 years.
I have incredible faith in our probation professionals, many of whom, this is no age jab, but have spent a good portion of their lives taking care of young people. And I often make fun of the probation people because they're a bunch of touchy-feely and they care. and there's no doubt that they lose sleep at night worrying about the youth and their care. And I would disagree with Mr. Butnick on several points, which I tend to do often, but I don't believe these probation chiefs would get up here on just a monetary basis. I don't believe that if they really felt that this would make a difference in the safety and security of their young people, their kids they're in charge with, that would come up here. Now, you've cited several individual incidents, and we're all microcosms of society, whether it's the police, whether it's the fire department, whether it's movie directors who are many charged with sexual assault. And
Thank God I'm a producer.
yeah, you're all the same. You're all the same. But no amount of staffing is going to get rid of those individual incidents because they're human beings and there's good and there's evil and there's human beings. So I put my faith in our chief probation officers on the board, the incredibly talented group that has stepped up here and will follow Mr. Powers and support option 1.
Just real quick. Obviously up in Lassen County, small rural county, we have a regional facility that serves some counties up on the northeastern corner of the state. And we're struggling to keep our hall open also. We don't want to have to transport our youth across the Sierras, which we would have to do if we ended up closing. But unfortunately, the small rural counties are struggling. And this would adversely impact our county as well as those we contract with for housing purposes. And I agree with Sheriff Dean. I think clearly our probation chiefs do a wonderful job. They care about their youth. And I do agree that ultimately a portion of it is about the money. And I would hate to see all the progress that we've made in our halls related to programming be adversely impacted by this change in standard. And clearly our facilities were built, as Mr. Powers indicated, they were built around our staffing plans, our facilities and everything are built around that 1 to 10 standard. And I think to change that now, would unfairly harm the operations of our probation chief. So I also support option 1.
Chief.
Yes, and in reviewing all of the background materials, and there was a lot of information provided, obviously a lot of testimony before us this afternoon. And I would argue also that we're not decreasing the staffing ratio, we're maintaining, well, option 1 would maintain the current staffing ratio. I believe based on the information that's been provided, it's not only working, I believe there's a lot of success stories throughout the county. Also, there's no information or no research nationwide that would compel us to provide a reason why there would be a need to increase the staffing ratio. And again, we have a lot of experience, a lot of people here before us who believe that the current ratio is working. And for those reasons, I would support option one.
And I doubt it's a surprise to anybody that I too support option one and am absolutely moved by the conversation on both sides of this issue, but reckoning with the fact that the Executive Steering Committee spent a great deal of time on this issue. They landed in a spot where there was virtually no recommendation. And so moving forward at this juncture with a recommendation, I think is ill-informed. Beyond that, and I know Mr. Steinhardt and I often have differences of opinion, I'm gravely, gravely concerned about any waiver. I think a waiver is a lack of regulation. And I am concerned when we have a issue this substantive and this pertinent to day-to-day operations, if we begin to reach in and do waivers, we do nothing but harm the industry, in my opinion. While we have done waivers on particular pilot projects that may eventually result in new regulations, I do not think when we have a substantive issue of this nature, which is basically the foundation of how facilities run, we are really doing harm, in my opinion. And I think we have to stand with the regulation as it is now and yet again continue down the path and the conversation that is reckoning with our changing industry. And we have lost sight today, unfortunately, in my mind, of the many, many progress and reduction in crime rates and the things that we have done, and the fact that many juvenile facilities are standing with empty beds, and that is a good thing. And to do anything that adversely impacts that in terms of a reduction of programming is unconscionable. And to offer people a nebulous waiver is another way to do harm. So I'll rest with that. Anybody else on the board?
One last comment. We keep hearing that the standard is arbitrary, but if it's DOJ's standard and PREA's standard, that just doesn't seem arbitrary. So I would love to see, again, we're going back to more study. I would love to see more study around this. Like everything I've seen, just as someone that has been in a juvenile hall every week since 2004, is better relationships with staff, kids change. And the more staff that are there, the more trained staff that are there, there's less misconduct, there's less abuse. So to me, those are two huge kind of pushes in the direction of more trained staffing is better. If we all can agree on that, is there a fourth potential? This could be a ridiculous suggestion. Chair, you can tell me if it's ridiculous. But I don't know is this something we must vote on today, or can we or somebody advocate during this budget session why we should go to a 1-to-8 ratio, why it is the national standard, why it is the DOJ standard, and ask for a budget allocation. And if we can get that budget allocation, then vote on it after that. And I would love to know from the chiefs at the table, does that help with most of your concerns, or would that not?
Let me respond, because I think ridiculous is a harsh word. I think the fact is that we have hours and hours of work that ended in remaining with the standard as we have known it. With that said, what you're talking about, to me, is a different system making the move. And budget allocations are not within our purview. We cannot sit here and mandate that reduction in staffing is better and then send money and allocation along with that. Now, a lot of the conversations that I've had with interested advocates reckon with the fact that it may have to be a legislative overture that changes the standards. I will say, I do not think that was what this executive steering committee did. They did not defer their obligation. They landed where we have stood for years, reckoning with the fact that we were doing no harm and there wasn't a great deal of evidence going forward that this reduction in staffing level would work. So the study, I think, will go on. I think it'll be heard in a different venue. Our reg, and I cannot say this loud enough and long enough, is a minimum standard. And we have to have that and allow chiefs to run their facilities. And if the legislature sees it differently, they'll make the changes they see.
It'd be great. I think everybody'd be real happy with more money. Ironically, once again, the proposed budget cuts money for correctional officer training. When everybody agrees in here, everybody, the gentleman from MIPA back there saying people need to be better trained, once again.
Well, we should all advocate together on that one.
Exactly. I agree. And they want better trained police officers, better correctional staff, but significant cuts 2 years in a row to that training fund.
And is that for CDCR, sheriffs, probation officers, everyone?
Yeah. Well,
it's not CDCR.
It's not CDR, but everybody else.
Oh, Kernan.
Oh, yeah, he got an increase. We got
Kernan got that wink, wink, nod, nod. Everyone else got.
Madam Chair, can I make a motion?
I had a comment before your motion, if you don't mind.
I believe Chief Brown was next in the queue, and then Mr. Steinhardt, and then I'll entertain a motion.
I just wanted to say to Mr. Budnick that I don't know too many chiefs that would turn down, some additional funds to do what we do. But that's not what we're faced with today. And I think Sue Burrell is, I think most would agree, is kind of an icon in her field, having done so many years and served so much time on various types of committees and venues to fight for various rights of youth. And I can say, interestingly enough, I think Sue was part of the group that sued us in San Bernardino County. And I have a great deal of respect for her. That's hard to do, to be that person. And then she has a lot of respect, I think, in that regard. I asked for and was willing to read anything that she would provide to me. And I can tell you she has her own notebook on my desk that's about 6 inches thick. And I think even up until just a few days ago, she was still sending stuff. I've read it all. I read everything. And a lot of it is at least 10 years old. There have been a lot of changes, especially in California. And I still land right back where we are at option 1 on leaving things alone. But if you can manage to get some more money out of legislature somehow for the chiefs, I'm sure we will take that.
Mr. Steinhardt?
Just a brief word in defense of waiver. I was not in support of what you called nebulous waiver. I don't like nebulous waivers, and I was in support of a waiver that was grounded in some very concrete specifics and based on investigation and approval. And waivers are not just excuses to backslide or do things sloppily. Waivers and alternate means of compliance are used across all systems to nourish and generate new best practices. So let's not paint waiver as just something bad. I think waiver and flexibility in what we do here in terms of regulation and enforcement is something we need to look more at. I agree the waiver proposal hasn't come together in a way that answers a lot of questions, even though I still support it as a way to go, because I think we should adopt the principle that is a national standard and then allow counties to work as they need to or catch up to that principle. So I can sort of see how this is going today, but I would like to suggest maybe in the Juvenile Justice Standing Committee that we look further at waivers and alternate means of compliance as avenues that we need to pursue in some circumstances.
I turn to you.
Second.
2 seconds. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? 3. Abstain? Motion carries. Thank you, all. Very difficult work.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, moving on to item G. Oscar, you were very patiently waiting in the back of the room. You were like a little pogo stick back there.
This is an easy one.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. Members of the board, my name is Oscar Villegas. I'm a field representative with the County Facilities Construction Division. So item G before you today is a scope change request by Santa Clara County. By way of very brief background, you'll recall Santa Clara County was one of the counties that was funded in 2015 under the SB 863 funding. Since that time, Santa Clara County has initiated various jail diversion initiatives and made some changes to the county's classification system. And this has resulted in more offenders being diverted from custody. More recently, in 2017, the county conducted a jail population projection study, which indicated that less beds would be needed than originally projected in 2015 when the county submitted its application and was funded. So since then, the county staff has been working with the BSCC on some conceptual adjustments to its project, and earlier this year submitted a formal letter requesting consideration of a scope change. If you have a copy of that letter in your agenda packet, the scope change before you today, if approved, would reduce the number of beds originally proposed from 815 to 535, a reduction of nearly 280 beds. Yet at the same time, increasing the total square footage by nearly 24,000 square feet. These requested changes would result in increased program treatment space, create a larger day room and housing area, create larger visitation space and court staging areas, and a larger public lobby. All the other uses that were originally proposed would remain the same. So in summary, the scope change is intended to help the county be more successful in achieving its programming and treatment goals. That concludes my presentation, unless there are any questions. And I also know that there happens to be several county staff that are present in the audience if there are any questions for them as well.
Any public comment on this issue? Looking to the board.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Swag. Okay then. So all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstain? Motion carries. Oscar, way to have the winner. All right, this is, we're closing in. We're now at the public comment section of the meeting where individuals may comment on any issue they wish. Do we have any people wanting public comment? Okay, seeing no public comment, I'll ask for a motion to adjourn. Oh, I apologize. Oh my gosh, Scott, that's bad. Mr. Budnick
Caught yourself.
did make a request, and I want to honor that at this point. Go ahead.
So we had, unfortunately, an incredible young man who was a victim of violence on Friday night and was the victim of a robbery and carjacking. He was 20 years old and he died on the scene. His name was Jesus Angulo. We called him Yayo. He had been, I met him when he was in the Pine Grove Fire Camp in CDCR and DJJ. Incredible young man, was the number 2 on his fire crew, an incredible firefighter. They described him as the guy that when people were tired, he would grab all of their chainsaws and he would hike 10 miles up a mountain with everyone else's chainsaws. Came out, wanted to be a wildland firefighter. He's from the county of Indio in Riverside County, the city of Indio in Riverside County, and he came to LA for a better life and for more opportunity. He lived in our housing in Koreatown. He went to LA Trade Tech College. He was in our union apprenticeship program, was doing incredibly well, was hoping to start the new parole CDCR Fire Academy in September, October. That was his dream. And unfortunately, that dream was cut short. And he was just an incredibly unbelievable young man. He was the one that motivated all of his peers that came out of DJJ to do right. He would get on them if they were smoking weed or doing anything. He would yell at them. He would scream at them. He would mentor them. He would guide them. And unfortunately, this incredible leader, this changed, transformed young man isn't around anymore. And so I just wanted to adjourn today in memory of Yayo. And just let's all stand committed to protecting public safety and stopping violence from happening in our community, especially to our young people.
Thank you, Scott. That was really thoughtful. And I just like to say it is your program. You know, as we look at these pictures, all these great experiences he's had are as a result of your labors. And while it's way too young for the young man to leave us, thank God he had you as a mentor. Lived a great life when you were in it. All right. Meeting adjourned. Thank you all. What? Jeff Dean.